Chapter 1322 Hold off on something unresolvable. Upon hearing the World Gehrman Sparrow's question, the other members of the Tarot Club had three reactions. Who is that? I seem to have heard of him. He's one of the four kings? Who is that? Why haven't I heard of him before? Oh, I forgot to ask about the psychology alchemists. I was planning on using a more tactful method to seek some suggestions. The first reaction came from Alger, Katlia, and Furs, who had lived at sea for a period of time. The second reaction came from Leonard, Emlyn, Zio, and Derek. The third reaction belonged to Audrey alone. Getting no answers, the World Gehrman Sparrow didn't ask further. His main goal was to use this as a reminder for Miss Justice to bring up the matter for discussion in a way that could bypass the promise she made. Of course, if Miss Justice were to seek help from Mr. Fool, Klein would also use grafting to temporarily connect the bindings formed from her subconscious to a paper figurine, providing her with a period of time that she could freely recount things. This was also a high-level application of paper figurine substitutes. With Klein's current level, he could easily do it within Sapphira Castle. If he were in the real world, he would have to rely on the worms of spirit above the gray fog to control the curtain and provide responses. At that moment, Audrey thought for a moment and said, "Do you still remember that I once pursued the whereabouts of a mine dragon and went to a place where they had customs of worshipping dragons?" Alger, Katlia, and company nodded. Only Leonard and Zio expressed their lack of knowledge of this matter. As this wasn't an important matter, Furs didn't mention it when she first briefed Zio of the general knowledge. After that, she was frightened by Angel of Imagination Adam, and rarely talked about the secrets shared by the Tarot Club in the real world. Audrey deliberated for a moment before continuing. It's been almost 2 years. A secret organization that doesn't trust me too much suddenly mentioned this matter and has entrusted me with further investigations. They said it's a form of observation. What motives do they have? She didn't think it was a coincidence. Emlyn recovered and laughed. This should be a test. To him, he was still very far from reaching Sequence 1 Beauty Goddess, and he had no intention of transferring to the Planta pathway. Therefore, he didn't need to worry about the corresponding problems for a long period of time. There was no need to worry too much about it. Emlyn's ability to say the word test shows how much he has improved. Of course, this is also because the Sanguine has done too many similar things to him, having to trouble Mr. Hanged Man into telling him that this is a test. The Fool Klein was very satisfied with Emlyn's answer. Of course, he didn't believe that the answer was correct. He only felt that Emlyn's ability to think up to this level was already pretty remarkable. Audrey said disapprovingly, "I suspect that they already know that I'm problematic. They even know where my problem is and which faction is involved. There's no need to test me further." After leaving the Garden of Eden, she had been thinking a lot. She remembered that Mr. World had once said that the Twilight Hermit Order wanted a war that would sweep the entire world. Based on the current situation, this goal has been achieved in the past year. In other words, the Twilight Hermit Order or Angel of Imagination Adam must have used this opportunity to gain quite a number of benefits and experience the corresponding growth. And before that, Mr. Fool informed them that Adam was ever closer to the level of a deity. Combining all this information, Audrey had a preliminary judgment that Angel of Imagination Adam had a high chance of already reaching the divine throne and becoming a Sequence 0 visionary. Even if he wasn't there yet, he wasn't too far. If such a deity who wielded the mind domain cast his gaze over, Audrey didn't believe that her secret could be hidden. At present, she could only console herself that the leader of the Twilight Hermit Order, the mastermind behind the psychology alchemists, wouldn't place too much importance on a Sequence 4 manipulator. On the one hand, she had made all sorts of preparations to deal with the possible accidents. Perhaps that organization is trying to figure how many members we have in the Tarot Club and what their identities are, Emlyn replied with a smile as he continued on his train of thought. Audrey thought for a moment and nodded. That possibility can't be ruled out. As she said this, she shot a glance at the end of the long, mottled table, and realized that Mr. Fool was only listening to her leisurely without giving her the correct answer. This made her feel a lot more at ease. At the same time, she silently decided that she had to be more careful. She had to be able to resolve problems herself, having already reached Sequence 4. In any Orthodox church or secret organization, Sequence 4 was the strongest person in control of an area. At this moment, Alger, who had heard their conversation, proposed a brand new possibility. If that secret organization really doesn't trust you, then it might be an excuse for them to do an observation. Their main goal is to cooperate with us, the Tarot Club, and Mr. Fool. He didn't know why Miss Justice didn't mention the psychology alchemists directly. All he could do was carefully go along with her. This is equivalent to me becoming an ambassador of the Tarot Club to the psychology alchemists? Audrey nodded slightly and said, that's also possible. Then what should I do next? Alger thought for a moment and said, stall for time. Good idea. Furs and Emlyn both expressed their agreement. After Alger gave the overall strategy, he added in detail, try to stall for time and find excuses not to go until the final moment. When you arrive there, start investigating from the periphery, and use caution as an excuse to slow down your investigation. If you really can't delay any further, you can deliberately make mistakes in certain matters and create some commotion so that the Mind Dragon can detect it early and eliminate any traces. If that secret organization really has any additional motives, the longer you delay, the more they won't be able to sit still. If they get impatient, they will expose the problem. Katlia nodded. This is the most suitable response for now. I understand. Thank you, everyone. Audrey also felt that Mr. Hanged Man's suggestions suited her thoughts. However, she didn't delay a certain matter. She immediately turned her head and looked at the end of the long mottled table. She bowed and said, Honorable Mr. Fool, has Angel of Imagination Adam advanced to Sequence 0? Not bad. To be able to be aware of this point. The Fool Klein leaned back in his chair and chuckled. Only with the apocalypse approaching did he finally take that step. The level of the Garden of Eden had virtually confirmed that Adam was definitely a visionary. Angel of Imagination Adam has become a god? This news immediately reverberated in Derek and company's minds, leaving their minds in upheavals for a long time. Indeed. Audrey pursed her lips and expressed her gratitude before asking, what kind of payment do I need to make for this answer? The Fool Klein surveyed the area and said with a smile, there's no need. It's a reminder. After this topic ended, because most of the Tarot Club members were still immersed in the impact of Adam becoming a true god, no one spoke for a moment. After a few seconds, Derek looked around and probed. The City of Silver has already plowed the surrounding fields and planted wheat and other crops, but the harvest will still take some time. I wish to know what we can do to earn gold pounds and purchase resources. After the initial aid, the Church of the Sea God and the government of the Rörsted Archipelago stopped providing free aid. After all, their financial strength was rather limited. In this situation, the City of Silver and Moon City each sold a batch of Beyonder characteristics and monster hides in exchange for a large amount of funds that could be used to purchase various resources. However, with the entrance to the Forsaken Land of the Gods closed, they were unable to replenish Beyonder characteristics and monster hides. It was also impossible for the City of Silver and Moon City to give up their military strength either, selling large amounts of combat resources and wasting the opportunity of nurturing their descendants. Therefore, once all the gold pounds, gold and jewelry were used up, they would undoubtedly fall into a predicament. For this reason, the 6-member council had been troubled over how to earn gold pounds from the outside world and how to establish a stable financial system. This was a little beyond their capabilities. The Beyonder characteristics that the City of Silver and Moon City had previously sold were mainly purchased by the Church of the Sea God and the Rörsted Archipelago government. They were used to establish official Beyonder factions under them. After all, the number of Beyonders needed to cause damage, and the number of Beyonders needed to stabilize an area was on completely different levels. In addition, the entire Rörsted Archipelago only had Sea God Calvetua and the demigod cardinal of the Church of the Lord of Storms. This was slightly insufficient for a new government, especially since the Church of Storms and the Church of Sea God weren't allies. After hearing Little Sun's plea for help, the other members of the Tarot Club began to seriously consider what the City of Silver and Moon City residents could do. Audrey thought for a moment and asked, what are you best at? Combat, Derek replied without any hesitation. Alger nodded slightly when he heard that. Although the World War has ended, law and order hasn't been restored in the colonies of the southern continent. It's still very chaotic there, and small-scale wars occur from time to time. You can try to form 2 to 3 mercenary teams and be hired by any faction. Private military contractors. Klein gave an even more modern name to the suggestion. This is a good idea. Derek's eyes lit up when he heard that. Alger asked again, combat is a survival instinct. Other than this, do you still have anything you want to do? Derek replied in embarrassment, many people wish to be chefs and brewers, as well as hope to work at candy factories. Chapter 1323 Development Plan. After hearing the City of Silver citizens' wishes, a thought suddenly surfaced in Klein's mind. Why is everything related to food? Alger thought for a moment and said to Derek, "You can make people with such thoughts join the industry association in Biome. Seek out suitable teachers through the association, and directly invite people with specialties in such fields to teach in the new City of Silver and provide generous salaries. Of course, the prerequisite is that you have to get the residents to grasp the language of the Rörsted archipelago as soon as possible. On this basis, Loanese, Ancient Fasak, and Dudanese have to be taught too." After the hanged man finished speaking, the hermit Katlia gave her suggestion. "Other than organizing the mercenary teams, you can also try to apply for civil jobs in the various cities of the Rörsted archipelago to handle supernatural matters." Although the Rörsted archipelago government and the Church of the Sea God had obtained a batch of Beyonder characteristics and the corresponding potion formulas from the City of Silver and Moon City, they were unable to nurture enough Beyonders in a short period of time. Sequence 9 was relatively still all right. The chances of someone being selected for their good mental strength and physique to lose control from consuming the potion were actually very small. If one were to further advance, acting might not necessarily be successful, and it also required time. Under such circumstances, as long as the residents of the City of Silver became members of the official faction, they wouldn't be worried about losing their jobs in the future. Of course, the Rörsted archipelago's government would definitely control the number of applicants. The City of Silver wouldn't be able to completely resolve everyone's employment problems using this route. Klein agreed with Mam Hermit's suggestion. Furthermore, he believed that there was a need for him to give a revelation to Danitz, allowing the Rörsted archipelago government and the Church of Sea God to increase the number of official Beyonders to a certain range. This wasn't to help the City of Silver's residents and the majority of the deformed people in Moon City find jobs, but to deal with the impending apocalypse, the deeper corruption of the outer deities, and the gradually increasing frequency of supernatural incidents. At that moment, Katlia glanced at Miss Justice and continued speaking to Derek. "You should now have a large amount of liquid funds. You can try to invest in the mines, spice plantations, farms, and purchase fertile land and forests with rich produce. They're all very cheap now. Yes, although the Church of the Lord of Storms can still influence the archipelago, and although the new government promises to protect the local businesses, there is still a large number of people from Lone, Fasak, and Intis who lack confidence. They wish to cash out and return to their countries as soon as possible. That oracle named Danitz recently bought a spice plantation." Derek recalled what he had heard before and immediately felt enlightened. Katlia's suggestion gave others inspiration. Audrey immediately added, "When negotiating, it's best if you invite some professional lawyers. If not, you'll be fooled easily. Well, if you think there's a need, you can bring along a psychoanalyst from the city. Also, you have a medium-sized port that can develop the corresponding economy. While the official Beyonders of the Rörsted archipelago's government and the Church of the Sea God are lacking in generation knowledge, you can set paid classes designed for outsiders in the new City of Silver savant schools. Well, remove the knowledge that will easily clash with the Orthodox Church. The railway connecting the new City of Silver and other cities must be built as soon as possible." Derek was taken aback when he heard that. He hurriedly raised his hand and said, "Sorry, I need to memorize what was just said. I forgot that he has no foundation in economics." Audrey reflected on herself, closed her mouth, and smiled as she signaled for little son to seek help from Mr. Fool. After Derek conjured a pen and paper and wrote down the previous suggestions, Audrey, Emlyn, the Star Leonard, and the other members of the Tarot Club offered their ideas one after another. They also rebutted the suggestions that weren't mature or pragmatic enough. This intense scene lasted for nearly half an hour before ending. Derek looked at the adequately thick pieces of paper in front of him and couldn't help but smile. He seemed to have seen the beautiful future of the City of Silver. Sitting at the end of the long mottled table, the fool Klein sighed for some baffling reason as his heart felt a lot heavier. If one didn't consider how the apocalypse was about a decade away, the discussion would have been pleasing regarding the promising future that awaited the City of Silver. However, the arrival of the apocalypse wouldn't change because of the will of humans. Even saints and angels couldn't do it. Looking away from the paper in front of him, Derek deliberated and said, "We have already built the temple and cathedral meant for Mr. Fool. We wish to proselytize to various cities in the archipelago. What do we need to pay attention to?" Alger frowned slightly and said, "Have you written a holy Bible? Have you designed the order of Mass and prayer details?" "Yes." Derek nodded heavily. That was based on his knowledge of the miracles Mr. Fool had shown, combined with the religious scriptures left behind by the Creator. Furthermore, the City of Silver had also prayed to the Fool seeking his thoughts on the matter. His attitude was a tacit agreement. Has the internal system of the church been set up? Alger continued asking. Derek subconsciously looked at Mr. Fool, who was shrouded in layers of grayish-white fog, and turned around. Currently, it's following the internal system of the other churches. The chief of our 6-member council will hold the role of archbishop, and a number of enthusiastic citizens have been appointed as bishops and priests. The City of Silver didn't set up an organization to deal with Beyonder matters within the church, since most of them were Beyonders, and there were already the corresponding organizations in place previously. Alger saw that Mr. Fool didn't object nor agree. He controlled his desire to teach and nodded slightly. You can try that out first. He paused for a moment before saying, however, there are 2 things to take note of. First, don't badmouth the other churches, lest there be conflict. Second, it's to respect the current oracle. In the absence of a leader appointed by Mr. Fool, the oracle is the representative of a deity. Third, don't engage in religious harassment during proselytizing. Besides, I have serious doubts about the eloquence of the bishops and priests of the City of Silver. I'll need to get Danitz to find professionals to train them. The fool Klein, who was listening quietly, muttered inwardly. He didn't express his opinion on the Holy Bible written by the City of Silver, because it was a little awkward, but if he objected to certain descriptions, it would also damage the fool's image. With this in mind, Klein couldn't help but lampoon. Perhaps one day, when Willa Septon reads the Holy Bible of the Church of the Fool, he would blurt out in surprise. When did I become an angel under the fool? Then, Leonard's grandpa, the awakened Mr. Azek, and Miss Messenger, who has been trying hard to recover, will add, what? Me too. After the conversation regarding the City of Silver and Moon City came to an end, Katlia looked around in anticipation and said, which of you has a sequence 3 Beyonder characteristic of the mystery prior pathway? She had already digested the mysticologist potion for quite some time, but she had only obtained the potion formula from the Moses ascetic order. She was still far from obtaining the Beyonder characteristic or the main ingredients. Although she was one of the 10 key members of the Moses ascetic order, the corresponding resources became more valuable the higher the sequence. Even an ancient organization wouldn't squander them freely. Furthermore, Katlia came from the dawn and was less affected by the hidden sage, so she wasn't that trusted in the Moses ascetic order. To Katlia, who had already digested the potion a long time ago using the Snake of Fate's blood to advance to a mysticologist, Sequence 3 should have been a relatively easier stage. However, she was bottlenecked by the ingredients. It might not even be possible for her to obtain one for years or even more than a decade. Hence, she had no choice but to seek help at the Tarot Club. Derek recalled the demigod characteristics that the City of Silver had and slowly shook his head. At that moment, the World Gairman Sparrow said with a hoarse chuckle, I suggest you ask Queen Mystic directly. Bernadette had already become a Sequence 2 angel. If she had an additional clairvoyant Beyonder characteristic in her, she could attempt to separate it. Of course, Klein couldn't be certain that the sage potion that Queen Mystic consumed contained the previous Sequence 3 and Sequence 4 characteristics. Ask the Queen? Katlia got some clues from the world's answer and suspected that something had happened to the Queen. Okay. She controlled the urge to ask. Klein continued controlling the world and said to Ma'am Hermit, I have a long-term mission. Help me collect information regarding the hidden sage's sudden coming back to life. You can raise the corresponding remuneration now. Or you can wait until there's a need in the future. Klein was still puzzled over this matter. Although it could be described as a uniqueness suddenly coming to life, it should have happened a long time ago if it was possible. Katlia thought for a moment and said, that wouldn't be an issue. After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering ended and the members returned to the real world. In the captain's cabin of the future, Katlia nudged the heavy glasses on her nose bridge and thought about how to write the letter to the Queen. During this process, she strolled to the window and saw Frank Lee promoting the alcohol-free volcano beer brewed by sea microorganisms to the crew. He really has the drive. Just as Katlia sighed, she suddenly frowned. At the Tarot Club just now, Mr. Fool mentioned that the planter and the moon are 2 rather special pathways. They come from the cosmos, and they are prone to corruption. The divine epiphanies they receive are questionable. Frank is a Beyonder of the planter pathway. Besides, He once complained that the Church of Earth Mother didn't understand the true will of the merciful Mother. Katlia's eyes that were blocked by the heavy lens narrowed slightly. Chapter 1324 Handling. After staring at the deck below, Katlia left the captain's cabin and walked to the cabin's entrance. She waited until Frank Lee carried a bucket of alcohol-free beer over. "Captain, do you want a cup?" Frank raised the large bucket of beer with one hand. Katlia shook her head firmly and asked in a seemingly casual manner, "Is this the will of the benevolent Mother?" "No," Frank said rather seriously. "I just feel that drinking liquor that has been altered by a modified sedative isn't good for the body. I hope that they'll be able to accept this drink that has no alcohol inside, other than the smell of alcohol. Of course, this is only a preliminary result and it doesn't involve liquor. After all, it can't use distillation to enhance its taste." Katlia was momentarily at a loss for words as she nudged the heavy glasses on her nose bridge. After 2 seconds of silence, she said, "Do you hear the benevolent Mother's voice or divine epiphanies?" "No." Frank didn't think much of it as he shook his head. "Phew." Katlia secretly heaved a sigh of relief. At that moment, Frank casually added, "The benevolent Mother's will is in the ears of the wheat, in the milk of cows, in the growth of mushrooms, and in every corner of nature. One can feel it without the need to experience the divine epiphany." Katlia's gaze immediately shot towards Frank's eyes. She didn't find any signs of madness, only pureness. Without another word, she nodded slightly and walked forward. She crossed Frank Lee and arrived on the deck. After taking in the sea's vista for a few minutes, Katlia returned to the captain's cabin. She unfolded a letter and wrote, "I wonder what's your take regarding Frank's actions? He claims that he doesn't obtain any divine epiphanies, and believes that the benevolent Mother's will is hidden in every nook and cranny of nature." This was a letter to Gairman Sparrow. Katlia believed that just by adding such a question, he would be able to understand what she was implying. After folding the letter, she took out a gold coin and began to summon the terrifying messenger. "Ma'am Hermit wrote me a letter immediately after the tarot gathering ended. It shouldn't be related to the hidden sage. It can't be that fast." Klein was on a cruise ship, traveling on the Tussock River. Wearing a black robe, he took the letter from Miss Messenger's mouth and opened it. He finished reading all the content with a glance. "This..." Klein frowned slightly. Perhaps it was because Frank had shown enough danger and madness in his usual behavior that he had actually neglected the possibility of this druid being affected by the Mother Goddess of Depravity. Frank had once been placed on trial by the Church of Earth Mother for a forbidden experiment, and then he was placed on a wanted list. If Earth Mother hadn't been corrupted, and the Church of Earth's operations were rather normal, then it means that they believe that Frank is problematic. However, if there's concrete evidence, Frank, who went to the court, probably wouldn't have lived. Klein's mind raced as he attempted to find clues based on his understanding of Frank. There's no problem with the relevant actions. The prayer posture and his usual prayer gestures are different. It's just like how when the Beyonders of the Church of Evernight pray, they won't draw 4 stars on their chests at times. At most, they'll just go through the final motions. Apart from this small problem, there's something wrong with Frank in every aspect. He's like a child raised by the Mother Goddess of Depravity. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein had 2 contradictory guesses. Either Frank's corruption was very hidden, making it impossible for the Church of Earth Mother's tribunal to be certain, or he wasn't affected by the Mother Goddess of Depravity at all. It was purely because he had a mental problem that made him look like a blessed of an evil god. Regardless of which guess it was, Klein believed that the subsequent development wouldn't be good. He remembered very clearly that Frank's mushroom experiment had a breakthrough because he had been given an assistant who believed in the primordial moon. And the primordial moon was one of the manifestations of the Mother Goddess of Depravity. That also meant that from that moment forth, regardless of whether Frank had any problems in the past, he could very well have entered the eyes of the Mother Goddess of Depravity. This wasn't a good thing. Of course, I can't eliminate the possibility that Frank is excessively crazy, causing the Mother Goddess of Depravity to just look away. Klein mumbled in amusement, hoping to make the best out of it. This was nearly impossible. The horror and strength of a foreign god wasn't something a demigod could understand. Klein even suspected that if it wasn't for the overly intense response that would destroy the anchors of the deities, allowing them to attack each other in a frenzy, resulting in the Beyonder characteristics to gather and awaken the oldest one, the outer deities might have already destroyed the sun and destroyed the ecosystem of the world. They weren't able to do anything to the oldest one's barrier, but they were free to do anything to the star outside the barrier. Sometimes, Klein wondered if the astronomically observed sun was real or not. Perhaps it was just the eternal blazing sun that hung himself there. So far, there shouldn't be any major problems with the mushrooms that Frank invented. I've already dealt with them above the gray fog. Furthermore, the residents of the city of Silver and Moon City didn't show any abnormalities. Yes, after they left the forsaken land of the gods, they abandoned farming mushrooms because they lacked monster corpses and had sufficient food. The more Klein thought about it, the more fearful he felt towards it. If it wasn't for the fact that the Mother Goddess of Depravity's powers that could penetrate the original barrier was still extremely limited, Klein suspected that the cards of blasphemy and mushrooms would have left him corrupted. Sapphira Castle would have unknowingly changed owners. These were things that had been placed above the gray fog for a long time and didn't undergo any special sealing. Compared to the flamboyant Mother Tree of Desire, the usually low-key Mother Goddess of Depravity was far more terrifying. Mr. Dor and the Emperor were silently corrupted by her. As expected of an existence that stands atop the outer deities despite losing 2 Beyonder pathways and a Sapphira, Klein sighed inwardly. He took out a pen and paper and prepared to write a reply to Katlia. At that moment, he realized that Miss Messenger had been waiting by his side the entire time without returning to the spirit world. The 8 eyes of the 4 heads stared at him unblinkingly. What do you think of Frank? Klein hesitated before asking, other than his nickname. The 4 heads in Rionette Tinker's hands spoke one after another. He only appears like an adopted son of an outer deity. In other words, Frank wasn't affected by the Mother Goddess of Depravity previously. He was simply crazy. Klein heaved a long sigh of relief. He then asked, "What about now?" As Frank Lee summoned Rionette Tinker every time he wrote a letter to Gammon Sparrow, Klein believed that Miss Messenger, who had a very high status, had a relatively clear and accurate grasp of the state of the Mushroom King. "I don't know either," Rionette Tinker's 4 heads answered one after another. Following that, she added, "His body, temporarily, hasn't been corrupted. Does that mean that you can't tell if his psyche is affected?" "That's right. Other than his low level, Frank's usual actions resemble more of an evil god than me." Klein lampooned as he took out a gold coin and flicked it. With this medium, he quickly entered a dream divination state. At the same time, he was prepared to activate Sapphira Castle to cut off the outer deities from watching. Scenes flashed past as Klein saw several futures. Yes, the greatest threat right now is that primordial moon believer. I have to separate him from Frank, or things will become extremely troublesome and dangerous. If Frank doesn't come into contact with anything related to the Mother Goddess of Depravity in the future and doesn't advance to a demigod, there shouldn't be any problems. If only one of these 2 conditions is satisfied, the chance of an accident happening will increase greatly. If both are satisfied at the same time, I can't see the developments at all. Klein snapped awake as he interpreted the results of the divination. Perhaps because Frank's level was too low, and he wasn't too affected by it, Klein's divination happened smoothly without encountering any danger. Phew! He silently exhaled and caught the gold coin. Then, he realized that Miss Messenger's 8 red eyes were focused on the gold coin in his palm. Klein twitched his eyebrows, expressing his doubts. "It has Sapphira Castle's aura." Rionette Tinker's 4 blonde red-eyed heads shook up and down. "This is one of the 5 gold coins I often use for divination. It has already been tainted by the aura of Sapphira Castle? This way it can be considered a mystical item to a certain extent. However, the effect will be drained over time." Klein carefully looked at the gold coin in his hand and made a rough judgment based on his spiritual intuition. This gold coin could increase the accuracy of divination and enhance a user's ability to resist any interference. To Klein, this was a pleasant surprise. He decided to use the actual gold coin rather than its historical projection. Retrieving the gold coin, Klein wrote a reply to Ma'am Hermit and handed it to her through Rionette Tinker. After giving Gammon Sparrow's messenger another gold coin, Katlia unfolded the letter and quickly scanned it. After reading it, she felt her shoulders weigh down a little. Without any delay, Katlia took out another piece of paper and wrote, "Your Majesty, I dreamed of you finding that primitive island and successfully returning. The situation of that descendant of the Emperor is getting worse. If he continues staying on the future, I suspect he'll go crazy. If you don't mind, I want to send him over to you. What we need to take note of is that, although he claims to no longer believe in the primordial moon, No one has ever confirmed that. My greatest worry now is that it's difficult to obtain the main ingredient of a clairvoyant. If you have returned, I wish to find a time to return the magic wishing lamp to you. Chapter 1325. More than half a year later. City of Generosity, Byam. In a rented apartment lit up with gas lamps. Verdu Abraham, who was wearing a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, held a thick stack of information. He was reading seriously under the dim light, drawing a symbol and recording what he deemed useful information from time to time. He left Lone and came to the Rorsted Archipelago mainly to avoid being watched by Dorian and his other family members, and focus on studying mysticism. He wanted to find an effective way to save ancestor Bethel Abraham, or rather, reduce the difficulty of the known ritual. However, he hadn't made any headway after half a year. It was as though he had no other choice other than hunting a bizarro sorcerer, a parasite, and a secret sorcerer. This made Verdu rather depressed, but he was clear about how dangerous a Grade 0 sealed artifact was. Even if he was willing to sacrifice himself, he was unable to truly control it. He was unable to guarantee the final outcome. And the most important thing was that he couldn't find any bizarro sorcerers or parasites. They were all saints that were hard to track, with styles that were known for being strange and bizarre. Phew. Verdu put down the stack of documents in his hand and muttered silently. Don't tell me I can only place my hopes on the fool like Dorian and the others? Upon thinking of the fool, Verdu couldn't help but frown. This was because there were more and more half-giants promoting the fool's faith in Byam City, so much so that even he, who rarely went out, heard of it. This made him suspect if he had arrived near the headquarters of the Church of the Fool. If it wasn't for the mysterious knowledge that was spread in secret in the Rorsted Archipelago was far beyond Verdu's expectations. Many of them were things that the Abraham family didn't know of, and were extremely useful. He would have left Byam last month and headed for the southern continent. I can't stay here any longer. I need to buy ship tickets to East Balam as soon as possible. Just as Verdu made a decision, he began to waver. Dorian and the fool probably wouldn't expect me to hide in the area that's under their headquarters jurisdiction. Emperor Roselle once said that the most dangerous place is the safest place. After some hesitation, Verdu put down the documents and switched off the lights. With the moonlight from the window, he walked towards the bedroom. At the corner of the balcony in his room, a figure suddenly jumped out of the darkness and jumped over the railings. The figure was like a feather, light and weightless. It landed from a height 10 meters above the ground, without making a single sound. Right on the heels of that, the figure moved through the shadows to the vicinity of the Church of the Sea God and went up the bell tower. Then, he took out a pen and paper and wrote the report on tonight's surveillance before stuffing it into a crack. After the figure left, a howling wind suddenly sounded above the bell tower about 15 minutes later. The report was pulled out from the crack by an invisible hand. As it swept through the wind, it rose and fell into the distance like a bat spreading its wings in the dark night. Not long after, the report plummeted like it had been bound to a rock, landing on a hand that extended out in a hidden corner of the garden. This hand belonged to the Cardinal of the Church of Storms, Alger Wilson. He then unfolded the report and began to read it in the darkness. He was completely unaffected by the lack of light. Even in the dark sea, Alger could see everything around him clearly. Verdu is becoming more resolute in his intention of leaving Byam. Alger nodded indiscernibly as he came to a conclusion. Over the past half a year, he had been monitoring this member of the Abraham family according to Mr. Fool's instructions, but he hadn't noticed anything abnormal about him. After Verdu left the Rorsted Archipelago, his mission would be completed. However, Alger didn't wish for it to end just like that. He believed that he hadn't made enough contributions. All he did was simply monitor a Sequence 7 Beyonder without any special characteristics. The Hermit had already obtained a Sequence 3 Beyonder characteristic from Queen Mystic, and had gathered the corresponding supplementary ingredients and was busy preparing the ritual. This made Alger deeply stressed. Of course, he had also done many things according to Mr. Fool's intentions, but even he felt that there was a huge difference from doing those tasks, with the identity, status, and strength of Sea God. For a moment, Alger wanted to use all sorts of methods to force Verdu Abraham to expose himself, but in the end, he gave up on the idea. This was because he couldn't be sure of Mr. Fool's attitude towards the target. Previously, when the City of Silver and Moon City sold Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas, Alger had purchased some from the Tarot Club. He had used it to secretly nurture a team of Beyonders who were loyal to him. This was how he had people monitoring Verdu. Currently, this less than 10-member team was mostly at Sequence 9, while only a small number of them had been promoted to Sequence 8. As for where Alger had obtained the money for purchasing Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas, the answer was very simple. As a cardinal of the church diocese, Alger could easily save a sum of money for himself. And during that period of time, the minerals, farms, spice plantations, and factories in the Rörsted archipelago were sold at below intrinsic value. As long as one had the funds to buy them, they could earn a lot after a short period of time. More importantly, the Church of Storm's headquarters was quite interested in the Beyonder characteristics and potion formulas sold by the city of Silver and Moon City. They provided a large sum of money for their purchase. The go-between was without a doubt the cardinal of the Rörsted diocese, Alger Wilson. It was understandable that some losses were inevitable during such situations. Reining in his thoughts, Alger decided to sell some mysticism knowledge in Byam's Beyonder circles through his shadow guards. He wanted to bait Verdu Abraham and keep him in the vicinity for as long as possible. The main reason is that the City of Silver's preaching has frightened that gentleman. Alger shook his head and muttered inwardly. He then destroyed the report in his hand and walked back into the cathedral. The sky had just lit up, and a young man walked out of the hotel, leisurely enjoying the scenery of Byam's morning. He had just bought the Tina beverage that was packaged with the fruit's shell when he suddenly felt a huge shadow appear beside him. The youth turned his head and looked up bit by bit only to find a 2.5-meter-tall half-giant walking over. "Excuse me, sir. Do you have a moment to talk about our Lord and Savior, Mr. Fool?" The half-giant bent his back and tried his best to make his smile appear amiable. The youth drank a mouthful of Tina and pointed to the side. He smiled and nodded. "Sure, but not here." He then walked to a place where they wouldn't be in the way. The seemingly oppressive half-giant followed warmly. "Go ahead." The youth didn't hide his curiosity at all. The muscular half-giant's expression turned solemn. "My lord claims to be the Fool. In the past, the present, and also in the future, he is the great ruler who dominates the spirit world. He is also the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. He is also the landmark when every living being seeks eternal life. My lord lives above the real world and the spirit world. His benevolence spreads across heaven and the land. There are a total of 6 angels under him. The angel of Mercury is the embodiment of fate, my lord's most cherished angel. The angel of death has followed my lord for the longest period of time and is the consul of the underworld. The angel of redemption is my lord's bugle, the messenger of his revelations. The angel of life is the crystallization of wisdom itself. She is the indestructible spirituality that resides in everyone's body. Upon hearing that, the youth laughed. Your lord is really impressive. He actually has so many angels to serve him. Not only that, the half-giant replied gently. There's also the angel of retribution beside the Lord's throne. He is the Lord's lightning, the Lord's rage, and the Lord's palm. It's all the judge of the fallen and the ones who aren't chaste. In contrast to the angel of retribution is the angel of time. He is a king of ancient times. He eventually submitted to my lord and now strikes the bell of heaven. Impressive, impressive. The youth sincerely sighed. Upon hearing such a response, the half-giant couldn't help but smile. Then, he described the various miracles that Mr. Fool had performed as succinctly as possible. Finally, he said, "It's already been 15 minutes. I won't waste your time. If you're interested, you can go to the Fool's Cathedral on 16th Phillip Street. This is the biggest cathedral in Byam City. Heh, the rest are still in planning." The young man nodded. "I'll pay a visit if I'm free." After watching the half-giant turn and leave, the youth took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and wore it on his right eye. The half-giant walked straight back to a restaurant and changed into a chef's attire. "Baldur, you went proselytizing again?" the restaurant owner asked with a smile. When the Industry Association recommended this half-giant to learn culinary skills from his restaurant, he had been rather reluctant. He always felt that the other party could kill him with just a swing of his arm, and he didn't seem like someone with any culinary talent. However, he was now very pleased with Baldur. Not only was he humble, obedient, and willing to take hardship, he had quite the intimidating demeanor. This scared off the gangsters who had placed their sights on the restaurant. The only problem was that he would go out every morning to proselytize the Fool. Of course, the restaurant owner couldn't say anything since it wasn't working hours, so he didn't mind. Baldur smiled honestly and walked into the kitchen. He said to his good friend Bon, who had come from Moon City to seek refuge with him, "I can teach you how to roast fish today." Bon looked rather normal, but his eyes appeared awkward with one looking up and the other looking down. He was one of the citizens from Moon City who wasn't very deformed, and he had the courage to interact with the people outside. He nodded. "I have to pray in a moment." Mr. Fool sent a revelation to get all the residents of Moon City to pray to him at 9 in the morning. We are to wish that we are no longer deformed. Chapter 1326 Successful Mass. Regarding the matter of praying to Mr. Fool, Baldur raised both hands and feet in agreement. He didn't have any intention of pressing Bon. He prayed for more than a minute after waking up in the morning and before sleeping at night. He would thank Mr. Fool for bringing the pure sunlight, delicious food, and a life of no despair. "All right, I'll prepare the ingredients for today first." Baldur smiled as he nodded at Bon. A few minutes later, he brought many bags of ingredients into the kitchen, as if he was carrying a few rolls of curtains. At this moment, Bon found a chair and sat down. He sincerely prayed to Mr. Fool. "The great ruler who controls the spirit world, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, I wish to be blessed by you. I hope that you can fulfill my wish of escaping from my deformity." In the cathedral on Phillip Street, in several areas in Byam, in the new city of Silver, and the new Moon City that was located in a forest, prayers echoed softly simultaneously. The extremely self-conscious Xiaofan, Russ, and company vaguely guessed that Mr. Fool was planning on granting such a wish. As they prayed, their bodies trembled, unable to control themselves. They yearned to be like normal people. They were also looking forward to the bustling and lively Byam. They yearned for the grilled fish made from a secret recipe, the candy factories, and delicacies from all over the world. They yearned for a life to drink, chat, sing, and dance. In the ancient palace above the grey fog, the Fool Klein, who was sitting at the end of the long bronze table, saw bits of pure light light up one after another, forming a majestic sea of stars in front of him. The prayers overlapped and echoed inside Sapphira Castle as ripples appeared. Klein closed his eyes and took it in for a few seconds. He raised his right hand and bent his middle finger, wrapping the edge of the long mottled table. An invisible force spread out like waves on the surface of water. It surged into every prayer point of light and landed on the residents of Moon City. Xian suddenly felt something and raised her hand to touch the middle of her face. The next second, she felt her nose. Almost instinctively, Xian stroked that position several times from top to bottom before she believed she had grown a nose and was no longer deformed. She instantly closed her eyes, bent down, and pressed her forehead to the ground. She couldn't help but praise Mr. Fool. The praises around her grew louder and louder, becoming more and more uniform. Russ's eyes separated, Bon's eyes became symmetrical, and in Moon City, every deformed person, or those who were ugly because of the traits they inherited, had broken through their original restrictions and their bodies were transforming towards a state of normalcy. At this moment, be it in New Moon City, the new city of Silver or Byam, they heard the bell of the cathedral ring. Gong! The ethereal gong of the bell reverberated in the hearts of everyone in Moon City. It rang in the ears of every person who heard it, as though it could cleanse their souls and bring them the most genuine feelings towards life. The tears that Xian, Russ and company held back finally flowed out. They felt their minds and bodies turn tranquil, no longer having a speck of dust tainting them. They subconsciously raised their heads and cast their gaze towards the source of the gong. They discovered that it came from beyond New Moon City, an unknown distance away from where they were. A miracle! A thought suddenly popped into the minds of the Moon City citizens. In the new city of Silver that was connected to them, Wait Chermont and company cast their gazes into the distance and cast their gaze towards Byam. The gong came from there. Praise Mr. Fool! They mumbled at the same time as they pressed their right palm to their left chest. In Byam City, Bon adjusted his postures with Baldur who had tears streaming down his face. They faced Phillip Street and towards the cathedral that belonged to Mr. Fool. They listened attentively and gratefully to the holy chimes from heaven. However, above the grey fog, the Fool Klein was somewhat astonished and confused. The sudden chiming of the bells wasn't within his plans. He then turned his gaze to the Fool's Cathedral at 16 Phillip Street. Almost at the same time, he used the prayer lights to see the tall bell tower that was attached to the cathedral. He saw a young man wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe standing at the top of the bell tower. This youth was holding a black bell hammer and was striking the bell repeatedly. As if sensing the gaze from above, the youth stopped. He lifted his head slightly and adjusted the crystal monocle on his right eye. At the same time, his smile widened. Klein nearly cursed. At this moment, his eyes glazed over almost in an unconcealed manner. He didn't understand why Angel of Time Amon would suddenly appear and seriously strike the bell of his cathedral. Klein was actually mentally prepared for Amon's and Zeratil's possible arrival. This was because there were just too many people in the city of Silver and Moon City. There was no way they could secretly integrate with the outside world. In other words, the city of Silver and Moon City would definitely be known to the various churches and secret organizations. Under such circumstances, be it public or private proselytizing, it wouldn't affect any future development. Therefore, Klein silently agreed to the City of Silver's attempts to proselytize the faith of the Fool. This was preparation for him to have more anchors for his advancement to Sequence 1. Due to this premise, he was prepared for Zeratil, Amon, and other hidden enemies to come to Biam. He even hoped that they would do so. Here Klein, who had the status and level of a king of angels in Sapphira Castle, was able to fully display his home ground advantage. As for the City of Silver, it also had Grade 0 sealed artifacts. It could completely resist Amon and take down Zeratil. Compared to his main body suddenly encountering a prepared enemy elsewhere, or the discovery of his marionette city, this was undoubtedly a better choice. However, Amon's current actions confused Klein. He didn't understand what the god of deceit wanted to achieve. 16 Phillip Street. Inside the Fool's Cathedral. The Archbishop on duty, the City of Silver's 6-member council's elder, Derek Berg, also looked up in astonishment at the stained glass. Rays of sunlight shone inside, allowing Derek to read one scene after another. As the black bell hammer fell, the tremors of the bell gradually stopped. I didn't arrange for someone to strike the bell. Derek frowned. As a member of the City of Silver, as a demigod in the Sun Domain, he had a sharp intuition and knew that something must have gone wrong. However, the strange ringing of the bell didn't bring any accidents. Besides the ringing, everything seemed normal. As Derek observed the surroundings with the help of his unshadowed beyonder powers, he quickly considered whether the bell had any symbolic significance in mysticism. After eliminating the possibilities, he suddenly recalled the Holy Bible of the Fool made up by the City of Silver. There was content related to the striking of bells. It was used to describe the relationship between Angel of Time Amon and Mr. Fool to confirm his true status. Towards that sentence, Derek was still against it because he knew that Blasphemer Amon wasn't Mr. Fool's blessed. Their relationship wasn't even harmonious, and was actually hostile. However, the lies he made previously had convinced the other members of the City of Silver 6-member council. They believed that Angel of Time Amon was the first entity appointed by Mr. Fool to cast down the light for the people of the forsaken land of the gods. It was because he had parasitized Derek, which had resulted in the subsequent changes, all the way until hope descended. Derek had wanted to explain, but he was embarrassed. That would only bring up too many lies, making him lose his image with the other elders of the 6-member council and citizens of the City of Silver. It was just like Miss Justice had said before, a social death. Finally, he chose to delay any actions, hoping that Mr. Fool would take a look at the Holy Bible. If there was anything inappropriate with the descriptions, he would definitely send a divine revelation to change the views. To his surprise, Mr. Fool didn't say anything and silently agreed with the contents of the Holy Bible. Could it be that Amon is striking the bell? Derek was momentarily dazed as he found it too unbelievable. He hurriedly lowered his head and began praying, reporting this matter to Mr. Fool. Above the grey fog, inside Sapphira Castle. Before Klein could eliminate Amon, the other party suddenly turned transparent and transformed into a beam of light before vanishing from the bell tower. What does this fellow want? If his father is the emperor and not the ancient sun god, then I can reasonably suspect that he is striking a death knell for me. As Klein checked if there were any Amons lurking in the bodies of the City of Silver and Moon City citizens, he analyzed Amon's motives without any clue in mind. Just as he was about to use divination to seek clues, Derek completed his prayer. Holy Bible. Holy Bible? The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he summoned from the junk pile the Holy Bible that the City of Silver had sacrificed to him. Previously, he had only flipped through a few pages, but he was too embarrassed to continue reading it. He took on a position of burying his head in the sand. Of course, He wasn't careless in this aspect. He was still extremely cautious. He used divination inside Sapphira Castle to confirm that the Holy Bible wouldn't bring him any harm. With this premise, he allowed the City of Silver to use this Holy Bible. He slowly took a deep breath and reached out his right hand. He flipped the scriptures page by page. His facial muscles began to twitch, and the corner of his lips uncontrollably parted. Klein flipped faster and faster. Finally, he saw the last page. Pah! Klein suddenly closed the book and threw it back onto the junk pile. After this miracle in Moon City, yes, the potion has mostly been digested. The Marionette City will have to step onto the stage of history. Klein observed his condition without expression and nodded indiscernibly. Ever since he had gained preliminary control of Sapphira Castle, he could receive digestion feedback from the real world. Chapter 13:27 3 Plans. As for the Marionette Town, Klein had been thinking about how to build it a long time ago. He had already come up with 3 plans. If he eliminated any interference from external factors, his best choice would be somewhere in a certain country of the northern continent. He would allow his Marionette Town to rise up overnight. Furthermore, he would connect it to the surrounding cities through railways, rivers, and roads. This way, the Marionette Town would have large numbers of outsiders arriving on a daily basis, and it would create a very strong interaction with the surrounding areas. On the one hand, a town without a city nearby would definitely purchase grain, salt, cloth, ores, sugar, and other daily necessities. On the other hand, it would also produce its own products, which could be sold to neighboring cities, towns, and villages. Under such a situation, merchants, workers, tourists, and other groups would go back and forth frequently. At the same time, they would interact more with the Marionette Town's residents. Under the influence of all kinds of interactions between the parties, it wouldn't be long before the town of marionettes could produce a corresponding region in the spirit world. Once the lives of the residents became more detailed and real, Klein could consume the potion to advance to sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. This would take less than 3 months. But the problem was that this approach couldn't be kept confidential. In the present era, to have a town suddenly pop up was something that couldn't be hidden from people. Soon, there would be civil servants, the police, and reporters coming to investigate. And after that, the interactions between the parties would also make more and more people know and understand the city. This was a problem that couldn't be resolved through illusions unless the town of marionettes didn't interact with the surrounding cities, towns, and villages and had relatively minor interactions. However, that wouldn't meet the requirements of the ritual. When news of the marionette town spread, Klein would undoubtedly be targeted by Zeratul, Amon's true body, and his other enemies. When the time came, the destruction caused by others would definitely be easier than him protecting it. He could only migrate his marionette town elsewhere. This would cause the interactions generated in the early stages to be for naught, just like what the dark demonic wolf had experienced. Therefore, Klein had only listed down such a plan, so he basically wouldn't choose it. Unless a certain visionary was willing to provide help, making all the living beings in the northern and southern continents naturally believe that there was indeed a town there, one that hadn't suddenly appeared. During the process, Klein would send his marionettes to act as an outsider and maintain interactions with the corresponding real person, allowing the real outsiders to return to the real world without any gaps. In other words, there were 2 different lives playing out in the same city at the same time, but no one could notice that. Occasionally, some people would think that some details weren't right, but would find it inexplicable and might just ignore it. This was rather in line with the characteristic of an attendant of mysteries, and it had a certain level of concealment. Of course, this plan also had its problem. It was to simulate the fate of a marionette to a very high level, almost as similar as a human's. Without its own independence, it would cause the ritual's effects to fail. Klein tapped the edge of the long mottled table with his fingers and was in a dilemma over the second and third plan. After a few minutes, he did as his heart willed, cowardice, and chose the second plan. He would rather spend more time than affect the fates of the innocent. Back then, Zeratul and Antigonus likely chose the third plan. Klein sighed and prepared to return to the real world. At this moment, he looked at the junk pile and considered whether he should send a revelation to change the descriptions in the City of Silver's Holy Bible. To a deity, the Holy Bible wasn't anything too important. Its best use was for its convenience to spread its teachings and increase the number of anchors. Klein had long come to a conclusion from the revelation of Evernight, the Book of Storms, and the contents of the various Orthodox churches' holy Bibles. Most of the content elevated the Orthodox deity, making random claims of grandeur and expressed mercy and pity. In ancient times, the impression the believers had of the deities would indeed have a negative impact on the deities. But now, with the use of symbols instead of statues, this latent problem no longer existed. At the very least, the Evernight goddess, the Lord of Storms, and other deities openly declared that they were parts of the Creator's original body. They weren't worried that it would exacerbate the awakening of the oldest one. In other words, if there really was a problem with this aspect, Klein believed that the Evernight goddess would definitely have changed the corresponding description. She would have changed the description of being one of the eyes of the Creator to a child spawned by him. It too enjoyed a very high status. At the same time, the believer's acknowledgement of certain matters wouldn't have any burden on the deities themselves in a mysticism sense. Otherwise, Amon would have secretly helped Klein, or rather, prepare a batch of believers for the former Sapphira Castle to lure them into forming the belief that the Angel of Time was the manifestation of the Lord of the Mysteries. With the aid of an instinctual response that met the requirements, he could establish enough connections with Sapphira Castle and open a back door. To a deity, the Holy Bible only had two important components other than for spreading the faith. Firstly, it was a description of the authority and honorific name of the deities themselves. If there were any mistakes, it would lead to the prayers of the believers pointing to an unknown target. Not only would it be dangerous to the believers, but it would also cause the deities to lose their anchors. Secondly, any descriptions that involved the other churches would easily attract conflict. As for the angels and saints, the deities actually didn't pay them too much mind. The ones that cared were the angels and saints themselves because they needed to obtain a certain level of anchors through this. Therefore, the Holy Bible's descriptions of angels and saints were detailed enough. They had authority and honorific names, making it easier for different believers to choose and be immersed. In addition, this wasn't enough to form a stable anchor, because it was under the faith of a deity. In order to resolve this problem, the Orthodox churches would define certain cathedrals to different guardian angels and guardian saints and clearly differentiate them. Due to this knowledge, Klein didn't pay much attention to the Holy Bible. After he finished reading the description about his authority and honorific name, he stopped continuing out of embarrassment. He only used divination to confirm that the contents wouldn't result in a conflict with the Orthodox churches. After some thought, he gave up the idea of directly sending the revelation to change the Holy Bible and decided to use a gentler method. During the Tarot Club's exchange, he could use the World Gairman Sparrow to guide the son into adjusting his understanding of the situation, turning the parts involving the Angel of Time to Palaz Zoroast, allowing the corresponding content to be fixed without causing any suspicion in the City of Silver. Bayam, Verdu Abraham had obtained quite a bit of mysticism knowledge in a few Beyonder circles. He lit up the gas wall lamp and carefully read it in the night. Towards the end, he suddenly read a piece of news that he had never understood before. Bansi Harbor is a place filled with mysticism powers. Its connection with the spirit world and the astral world is beyond imagination. Even with the Church of Storms directly destroying the harbor, it still can't completely eliminate the abnormality of its existence. Many mysticism researchers are purchasing items related to Bansi at a high price. Bansi. Verdu muttered to himself silently, suddenly having a strong interest in the harbor. He began considering if he should buy some items from Bansi and do a thorough study of them. After all, the spirit world was related to teleportation. The astral world and the cosmos involved wandering, and might involve Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham's method of escaping. Perhaps if I have the chance, I could go to Bansi to take a look. Verdu nodded indiscernibly. Chapter 1328. The preparations needed. The initial preparations for building a marionette town were rather boring and tedious. At the very least, Klein believed so. In the ancient palace, Klein sat on the high-backed chair belonging to the fool, holding a fountain pen. There were ordinary pieces of paper with the name, age, and the fate of every marionette. As he made the worms of spirit emerge from his body, they formed avatars beside him. Some Kleins sat on the ground, while others occupied the 21 seats other than the fools. Some conjured beds and lay on them. Then, they summoned different books from the junk pile and started reading them seriously. The books included but were not limited to How to Brew Wine, Train Dispatching, Desert Making Compendium, A Clergyman Prepares, Gas Wall Lamps, Gas Meters, and all kinds of family machinery repair, Desilicacy, Harbor Management, Foundations of Law, Ladies' Aesthetic magazines. These were specialist knowledge that different marionettes needed to grasp. Only by doing so would they be able to act their roles well, allowing him to be realistic in every aspect. Even if they were to engage in a deep conversation with outsiders, they wouldn't expose any problems. It wouldn't be difficult for Klein if he just needed to simply memorize the knowledge, but he had to truly grasp and apply it. Furthermore, he couldn't confuse his characters. He couldn't let a burly and strong switchman with a low income be talking about the wonders of a particular skincare product, or which silk cloth was flawed. If such a situation were to happen in novels, plays and operas, it might create a strange attraction, but putting it in the real world was clearly uncanny and not beneficial to the advancement of the ritual. To avoid such a problem, Klein could only work harder in the early stages. He hoped that every character in a marionette town would be real, whole, and appropriate. Fortunately, there weren't many people in a city who needed to deeply understand the corresponding specialist knowledge. Most of the residents were half illiterate, or really illiterate. They relied on experience to live their lives that they repeated via motions. For these characters, the knowledge that Klein needed to grasp was relatively little, just like workers who had gone through simple training, or even without any training, to be sent to the assembly line. After an unknown period of time, Klein put down his fountain pen and rubbed his temples, letting out a long sigh of relief. He had finally written down the information about nearly 5,000 residents in the marionette town, and his corresponding knowledge preparation was almost complete. This is like a super large-scale movie directed by a director, and with me being the scriptwriter. Same for the lighting engineer, the makeup artist, and all the actors. For this ritual, I'm really on the verge of losing control. If I'm not careful, my personality will dissociate and I'll fall into the abyss of madness. Luckily, I have a professional psychologist. Yes, I have to pay attention to a problem in the town's operations. Although I'm a gentleman with manners, most of the residents in town have low socioeconomic status. Be it speaking or acting, they're more inclined towards being vulgar. I can't make a mistake during the acting and become set back by my psychological barriers. Klein sighed silently as the avatars around him disintegrated into worms of spirit before he got them to burrow into his body. Of course, this wasn't all. There was also one, Klein, who maintained his previous state, preparing to be on Sapphira Castle duty. In the next second, Klein returned to the real world and took out creeping hunger from the historical void. Then he teleported to an island that was located in the Berserk Sea, but one that clearly deviated from the safe sea route. This was the stage he had chosen before. This place was isolated from the storms all year round. There were no signs of human activity, only a large forest and animals that lived off the forest. Klein looked around and chose an open area. He pressed his right hand to his left chest and prayed sincerely, "I wish that there's a city suitable for 5,000 people here." Just as he said that, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, this open area became extremely flat. The surrounding forest also receded greatly, providing large amounts of wood, stones, and soil. Almost at the same time, buildings rose up from the ground. They took form with stone and wood. The highest wasn't more than 4 stories high. The style was closer to the Lone Kingdom's Desi Bay. In just the blink of an eye, residential buildings, a library, a police station, a telegraph office, a city hall, a small hospital, a candy factory, a water plant, a gas company, a steam locomotive station, parallel train tracks, and plantations outside the city took form. The streets were also paved with cement or stone bricks. Towards the end, on the square in the middle of the town, a pointed-tip cathedral emerged from the ground and stood proudly. This was a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess, as it was in line with the background setting of the city. "I hope this island has a deep-sea harbor." Klein didn't stop as he made a second wish. Pah! He snapped his fingers again, fulfilling his wish. About 3 kilometers away from the town, a small-scale harbor quickly took shape. There were 2 docks, 5 warehouses, a port hotel, a simple restaurant, a police station branch, a bar, a lighthouse, and a naval base. "I wish for the harbor and town to have convenient transportation." Klein made a third wish. He raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. A concrete road and a cargo rail instantly appeared between the town and the harbor. According to Klein's plan, a portion of the harbor was prepared for visitors by sea. The town was mainly for outsiders from the northern and southern continent. As he looked at the empty city with admiration, Klein pressed his top hat and teleported to the municipal square. He walked step by step into the cathedral named St. Ariana Cathedral. The cathedral's door was open, and it was dark inside. After an unknown period of time, 3 figures appeared at the door. They were a 30-year-old gentleman in a formal suit with a tie, an ordinary-looking and gentle-looking woman, and a child who was dressed like an adult. The woman took a few steps with difficulty before stretching her neck. Then, she smiled and reached out her hands to hold the gentleman's arm. The gentleman had a faint smile on his face. As he allowed the lady to lean on him, he reached out his right hand and held the boy. The little boy was skipping about, appearing very lively. Their actions were a little rough at first, but the more they walked, the smoother they became as they walked through the square. After they left, more and more people walked out of St. Ariana Cathedral. They consisted of the police, repair workers, gas company employees, restaurant chefs, white-haired old men, and simply dressed farmers. In the next hour, people constantly came out of the Evernight Cathedral. They either turned to different streets and went to different places, entering different houses, stopping at the square, or enjoying the pigeon-less scenery. During this process, the number of people that came out had exceeded the limits of the cathedral's capacity, but there seemed to be no end to the people, as though the interior was connected to another city. After another 15 minutes, the entrance of St. Ariana Cathedral finally fell silent. However, there were rats, cockroaches, moths, ants, flies, and mosquitoes creeping outwards. Finally, a colorful window at the top of the cathedral opened. White pigeons flew out and landed in the middle of the square. The people who had stayed there came to life completely. Some teased the pigeons, others looked for hawkers, while some played a 7-string guitar, and others smiled as they conversed with their friends. A man wearing a top hat and a trench coat and carrying a cane left the municipal square. He came to the other side of the town and stopped in front of a wooden board. He took out his tools and wrote the name of the town on the wooden board, Yarnum. After some thought, the man wiped away Yarnum and wrote another name, Utopia. Backlund. Inside the Hall family's luxurious villa. Alfred has already boarded the cruise ship back to the northern continent? Audrey didn't hide her surprise. It was September 1352. In the past half a year, Audrey didn't spend too much effort to make her father give up the thought of returning to Eastchester County for the first half of the year. This was because there was a pressing need to rebuild Backlund and Constant City. The kingdom's political scene also needed a new balance. Earl Hall had too many things to handle and wasn't in the mood for a vacation. Therefore, whenever Earl Hall was put in a difficult spot, she just needed to take the initiative to say that she was willing to remain in Backlund and return to Eastchester County in the next 6 months to have things develop as she wanted and receive praise for. As for the psychology alchemists, they didn't rush her either. Up to now, the Psychology Alchemists' Council meeting had been held 3 times. It was mainly to communicate their research results and the various information of the areas under their jurisdiction. Only Ma'am Greed had asked about the clues to the Mind Dragon twice. To be frank, if Mr. Fool hadn't reminded Audrey to take note of the rabbit, Wrath, and the easily forgettable president, she would definitely find the conference interesting. Mr. Rabbit had plenty of ideas, but she remained as vigilant as ever. Yes, the liner has already left the harbor. Earl Hall smiled and nodded. When Alfred arrives in Backlund and completes the necessary social intercourse, we will return to Eastchester County for fox hunting. Autumn was the best time to hunt foxes. Audrey tersely acknowledged. All right. As a major general in the army, Alfred didn't follow the naval fleet to Desi Bay. Instead, he led his adjutants and squires and boarded a steam-powered sailboat hybrid for Pritz Harbor. After traveling for nearly 2 days, they encountered a storm in the Berserk Sea. As the ship shook violently, the sailors on the observatory saw some light through their telescopes. It came from a lighthouse. Author's note: I wrote in detail 3 plans in the previous chapter because I felt that the 3rd plan was most impactful, but it's impossible for Klein to undertake it with his character, so I had to unfortunately give it up. I specially wrote it out for all of you to have a sense of what's the most bizarre and mysterious method. Chapter 1329. A night without any abnormalities. The liner passed through the storm and approached the lighthouse. A small-scale harbor entered the sights of the captain, sailors, and passengers through the gloomy rain. A short while later, a man in his 30s, who was wearing a blue uniform and holding onto a black umbrella and a glass lantern, appeared at the dock. He used rather uncommon actions to guide the liner to moor. As the man watched the gangway lower, he opened his mouth and shouted, "Hey matey, where do ya come from?" After most of his voice was swallowed by the wind, his voice successfully reached the liner's interior and entered Alfred's ears. "Do you know what this place is?" Alfred looked carefully at his adjutant and squire. He wasn't wearing a general's ceremonial attire. Wearing a black trench coat that was commonly seen in Backland, his dazzling blonde hair drooped down casually, and his blue eyes looked like a deep lake in a forest. The adjutant, who had neatly combed his hair to the back, first shook his head to indicate his uncertainty before he explained, "The storm from before made me lose my bearings." At this moment, the captain held an umbrella and came to the shipboard. He answered the man, "We left East Balham 2 days ago and unfortunately encountered a storm." "What harbor is this?" The man's eyes darted around for a moment. Without giving a direct answer, he shouted, "Wait a moment, will ya?" He then turned around, holding the umbrella and the lantern as he ran towards the buildings near the dock. This reaction was beyond the expectations of Alfred and the other passengers, but it wasn't strange for the experienced ship captain, first mate, and others. They had encountered many abnormalities at the ports along the Berserk Sea. This made them patiently wait for subsequent developments. 5 to 6 minutes later, the man led a lady over. The woman didn't have an umbrella and was wearing a hooded raincoat smeared with Donningsman tree sap. As the two of them approached the liner, under the watch of the armed sailors, they climbed up the gangway to the deck. At such a distance, most of the passengers finally saw what the two of them looked like. The man had brown hair and brown eyes. His skin was rough, and it was obvious that he was of a lower socioeconomic status and had suffered the elements. The woman was in her 20s, and her eyes were limpid green. She had long, flaxen hair. A few wet strands clung to her face, making her appear pure and charming. This was a rather pretty lady with a wild temperament. "Hi there, this is Utopia Harbor," the man impatiently introduced. "I'm Theodore, the interim port captain." As he spoke, he laughed, as though he was happy that he had invented such an amazing position. Of course, the ship captain knew what a so-called interim port captain meant. He didn't take it to heart about this sudden happiness of a small fry. He frowned slightly and said, "Utopia Harbor? Why haven't I heard of it?" Theodore looked at him and said, "What ye said is quite common. If it weren't for that landlubber hurricane, ye might never come here." Without waiting for him to say anything else, the lady rushed forward and said, "Utopia isn't on the safe sea route. Usually, only people who understand these waters and know of this place will come here for supplies." "So the main clientele of this harbor are pirates?" How could the ship captain not be able to tell what she meant? And in times like this, tacitly acknowledging things without exposing them provided protection to both sides. He tersely acknowledged and said, "And you are?" "My name is Tracy." The lady smiled. "I'm the owner of the Harbor Hotel, and also its receptionist and attendant." She surveyed the area and said, "It's quite a heavy storm, and the ship will be bumpy. It's not a wise choice to stay in there to rest. The hotel will provide you with stable beds, warm water, clean food, warm blankets, and an environment that will remind you of home. It's only 10 pence a night. I'm referring to the price of a single room. Other than that, you guys can still drink at the nearby bar and enjoy our warm hospitality." Clearly, this lady was here to solicit for business. The captain was rather alert and didn't respond directly. He nodded and said, "I can't decide on behalf of the passengers. They are free to choose for themselves. Of course, as captain, I will stay here with my crew." Tracy maintained her smile and said, "I'll wait at the hotel for guests who are willing to disembark." She seemed to have received a certain amount of education. She wasn't as hot and spirited as the women at other ports who spewed vulgarities with every sentence. Tracy turned around and was about to return when Theodore approached her and said with a sullen expression, "You have to thank me for telling you the news immediately." As he spoke, his right hand pressed against Tracy's but before he pinched hard. "Pah!" Tracy swatted away his hand and chided, "You're a jerk who should be fucked by a donkey." She took a few steps forward and left the liner by the gangway. Theodore shook his hands and cursed with a smile. "Bitch!" This scene suddenly moved many passengers on board. To them, the biggest flaw on the ship was that it was boring, and there was a bar at the harbor. This meant that they could meet cheap street girls who were unlike those from the northern or southern continent. There were local street girls with their unique local charm. If one was lucky or willing to spend a lot of money, one of them might even be able to sleep with that spirited beauty with an attitude. Instantly, many passengers packed their luggage and prepared to head to the harbor hotel. Upon seeing this, Alfred's adjutant asked, "General, are we getting off the ship?" Alfred shook his head slowly. "We don't know anything about this place. We have to be careful. Staying on the ship is the best choice." The adjutant had no objections to this. He asked worriedly, "What about those who have already alighted?" "That's their choice." Alfred looked out of the window expressionlessly. "If an accident happens, we can only keep more people safe. If it's not serious, then we will be able to resolve it easily." With that said, he turned to look at his adjutant and squire. "We'll take turns to keep watch tonight to prevent any accidents." Alfred, who had interacted with the Numinous Episcopate, the Rose School of Thought, and other organizations in the southern continent, had an instinctive sense of vigilance towards unfamiliar places. After he exchanged his opinion with the ship captain, Alfred got into bed, listening to the strong winds hitting the glass windows and the torrential rain pattering the deck. He was about to doze off. At this moment, he heard a tender and sad melody coming from the direction of the harbor. It seemed to come from a flute, intermittent like a human whimpering through the storm. Alfred was instantly immersed in the music. It was as though he had returned to Backland, which always appeared in his dreams. He returned to a state that was a mixture of his happy childhood days, the vexing times of his youth, and other emotions. He shook his head violently and shook off the feeling. He realized that it wasn't a psychological effect, but a normal person's reaction. Alfred rolled out of bed and walked to the window. Using his Sheriff Beyonder powers, he confirmed that the music he had heard had come from the cheap hotel. It's not from the guests on board the ship. Their goal is very clear. They wouldn't be in the mood to play such a melody. There are tourists in Utopia to begin with, or could it be that owner and part-time attendant named Tracy? If it were her, she would be a lady with a story. Alfred sighed and retracted his gaze. He stopped pondering over the matter. Although he was curious, he had no intention of getting off the ship. Soon, the sound of the flute stopped. The harbor hotel regained its silence and nothing unexpected happened. Just like that, time passed, and as the storm stopped, the sky gradually brightened. At 8 in the morning, the liner passengers returned one after another. Every one of them had weak steps and looked haggard. Upon seeing this, the sailors immediately laughed and said, "The chicks here seem pretty good." The passengers shook their heads at the same time and looked regretful. One of them rubbed his temples and said, "The Lanti-proof here isn't bad. It's cheaper than other places. I wasn't careful and had a little too much to drink and ended up falling asleep. I don't even know if anything happened with that babe. Sigh, I woke up to realize that the ship was about to leave, and I don't even remember what I did after getting drunk. Praise the lady. She let me lie in bed and not sleep in the rain." The other passengers chimed in to express their similar experiences. Of course, everyone had different details. For example, some passengers praised the breakfast dessert in the cheap hotel. The sailors were regretful that they didn't manage to drink the cheap and good Lanti-proof. They started teasing the passengers. "Perhaps the one who spent the night with you wasn't the chicks here but the burly man like Theodore. Since all of you were drunk, there's no way to know what happened. Haha, try touching your assholes." Amidst the lively atmosphere, the sailors withdrew the gangway and raised the sails, allowing the liner to set off slowly. Alfred finally relaxed after they passed through a dark sea and returned to the familiar safe sea route. He smiled at his adjutant and squire and said, "You can mark this place on our map, mentioning that the liquor and desserts here aren't too bad. Yes, the girls have their own traits." After a few more days of traveling, the passenger finally arrived at Desi Bay's Eskelson Harbor, after traveling along a winding safe sea route. Alfred, who had the demeanor of a noble, and his socialite instincts, paid a visit to the brass of a nearby military base and shared a good dinner with them. When he returned to one of his father's vacation villas, he was surprised to find the squire whom he had sent away to gather for information. "What's wrong?" Alfred put away his disorganized thoughts. The squire lowered his voice and said, "General, all the official maps in the kingdom have no indication of Utopia Harbor." Chapter 1330. Moving in. Alfred felt the room temperature plummet when he heard his squire. An indescribable chill invaded his body, freezing his blood and bone marrow. When the liner stopped at Utopia Port, he had expected the worst situation to happen. Utopia was the headquarters of some cult, and that everyone there was a dangerous lunatic. But now, the truth was even worse. Perhaps Utopia never existed. At that moment, Alfred was unusually thankful that he was no longer the noble scion he was when he left Backlund. He had accumulated a great deal of experience and had thus not really entered Utopia Harbor. Under the gaze of the adjutant and squire, the Major General paced back and forth with a solemn expression. He calmly instructed, "Draft up a telegram and report to MI9 about what happened in Utopia. At the same time, request the local official beyonders to immediately take action and contact the captain to list down all the people who entered Utopia Harbor. If necessary, pay each of them a visit and confirm if there are any problems." "Yes, sir." His adjutant immediately stood at attention and saluted. After the adjutant walked out of the study, Alfred said to a squire, "Bring up the typewriter from downstairs. I want to write a detailed report." His plan was to first use a telegram to report the key information to the brass and not delay the initial actions necessary. Then, he would reveal more details with a confidential document and provide more information for the military brass to make a decision. Wendell walked into a second-class carriage with one hand on his top hat and the other carrying a suitcase. He wasn't even 30 years old. His sideburns were deep black and his brown eyes were calm. He didn't have any unique features that anyone could remember, but he exuded comfortable vibes. A few months ago, he was still a Phanepotter intelligence officer who was active in Desi Bay, and had contributed greatly. Now that he was a Sequence 7 Beyonder, he was part of MI9's Internal Affairs Department. Today, his goal was to send a confidential document to Backlund and personally hand it into the hands of MI9's director. After sitting down, Wendell bought a newspaper from the paperboy and leisurely read through it. This was just a superficial act. In reality, he began to use his Beyonder powers to illustrate portraits of the passengers around him, remembering all their characteristics, making meticulous and perfect preparations for any accidents that might happen later. The steam locomotive was chugging forward as the scenery outside sped past the windows. A few hours later, Wendell cast his gaze out of the window with some anxiety. The sky was already filled with dark clouds, and a storm was about to descend. This meant that the steam locomotive would stop at a station ahead of time to tide through the storm. It might only continue its journey the next morning, and not reach its designated location. In Wendell's opinion, this would undoubtedly lead to more risks due to a deviation in his expectations. However, it was beyond him. He couldn't change the weather like the sea god, who was promoted by the Rörsted Archipelago's new government. The only thing he could do was pray to the Lord of Storms. Reality proved that praying was useless most of the time. By the time the sky turned dark, the station in front of them had already sent a light signal to get the train to slow down and stop. The steam engine whistled again, and the train slowed down. Finally, it stopped at an unfamiliar platform. In the next second, near the steam-powered train's head, the mechanical door opened. The train conductor stood at the entrance and shouted to the staff on the platform, "What happened up ahead?" "Heavy rain. Visibility is 0. The white sideburned employee answered loudly. Just as he finished speaking, a muffled thunder sounded, causing everyone to tremble as they sensed the incoming storm. "Damn it!" the train conductor cursed. "Which station is this?" As it wasn't a normal stop, he didn't really know which station he was at. After all, the schedule he was in charge of didn't stop at every station in the past. "Utopia. It's a small station. You can arrange the rest yourself." The staff shouted and ran towards the other end of the platform with the glass lantern in hand. "I have to give the train behind a signal." The train conductor had no doubts about the staff's attitude because this was a normal dispatch process. Otherwise, an accident between two steam locomotives would happen. He could even be certain that the other staff members of the Utopia station had already sent a telegram to the other stations to warn them. Of course, they must have received a telegram to learn of the area ahead being enveloped by a heavy storm. "Utopia?" Wendell repeated the name in a low voice, not finding any useful information in his mind. Of course, he didn't think too much of it. This was because there were many unknown steam locomotive stations in the entire Lone Kingdom. This was a manifestation of the country's overall strength. The train conductor looked at the dark sky and muttered a few words before using the newest megaphone to speak to the passengers on board. "A storm is coming. The train will stop at Utopia Station until 8 in the morning tomorrow. He estimated the storm to continue the entire night. You can stay in the carriage, or you can exit on your own accord to head into the city to look for an inn. Tomorrow, simply show your ticket stub to board the carriage again. Remember to be on time. The train conductor gave the passengers 2 choices. Wendell looked at the passengers inside the second-class carriage and pondered for a few seconds before carrying his suitcase and walking out of the train. It wasn't that he couldn't handle the harsh environment that wasn't conducive for good sleep. When he was an intelligence officer, he had been through plenty of hardship. He was only relying on his professionalism that the sealed carriages, which were limited in space for passenger movement, weren't as safe as a single room in an inn. Of course, he could also stay up all night, but this would definitely affect his condition tomorrow. Clearly, he still had a long journey tomorrow. After exiting Utopia Station, Wendell got on a rental carriage by the side of the road and said to the carriage driver, "To the municipal square." In the Lone Kingdom, there would definitely be a cathedral and a hotel near the municipal square. "Sir, are you planning on going to the hotel?" the carriage driver asked as he made the horse turn around, seemingly capable of getting along well with anyone. Yes. As a Sequence 7 Beyonder, Wendell didn't hide it. In his opinion, as long as he lived in the city center while overseas, he could easily find a group of helpers with his status, and his strength was enough to support him in completing this task. The best hotel in Utopia is Red Boots. Are we going there? The coach driver asked in a suggestive tone that all men knew. If he didn't have a mission, Wendell wouldn't mind pleasuring himself. However, he could only shake his head without any hesitation. "I want a quiet hotel." "All right," the coachman replied disappointedly. "Let's go to the Irises Hotel. No one will disturb you there." As the carriage advanced, Wendell cast his gaze outside the window to observe the situation outside. Perhaps it was because the storm was about to arrive, the people on the road were all in a rush. Even the paper boys looked down. A very small city. Wendell came to a preliminary conclusion from the lack of a track carriage. He only saw one trackless carriage. This meant that most of the areas in Utopia could be reached on foot in an adequate amount of time. Just as he had expected, in less than 10 minutes, the rental carriage stopped at the entrance of the Irises Hotel. Wendell paid the fare and rushed into the hotel before the rain fell. He heard pattering sounds behind him just as he entered. After checking in and putting down his luggage, Wendell rested for a while. He kept the confidential document close to him and went to the restaurant on the first floor to enjoy dinner. He cautiously didn't have any alcoholic beverages and asked for a cup of fizzling iced tea, which was supposedly a local specialty, and a fried pork chop drenched in apple juice. As a former intelligence officer of high society, Wendell didn't have much expectations for dinner this time, but he was surprised by the meal. The pork chop was fried in a succulent and juicy manner that gave off a strong fragrance. The apple juice that was poured on it had a slightly acerbic texture that washed away most of the cloyed taste. The fizzling iced tea was refreshing and especially delicious. When he foot the bill, Wendell nodded at the medium-billed waiter and said, "Please send my compliments to the chef for giving me the pleasure of this wonderful dinner." The ordinary-looking waiter smiled and replied, "That wouldn't be an issue. In all of Utopia City, our chefs are the best." Wendell didn't chit-chat and quickly returned to his room to make some arrangements to prevent others from sneaking in. Then, he fell asleep without any hesitation. He used a relatively safe period of time, which any possible enemies would find unsuitable for taking action, to sleep and pass the time late into the night. After an unknown period of time, Wendell was suddenly woken up by an intense argument. He snapped open his pocket watch to take a look and realized that it wasn't even midnight. "It's from next door." A woman's voice. A man's voice. Wendell sat up and listened carefully. Initially, he suspected that it was a man and woman flirting, but later, he realized that it was too intense. Some of the items were even thrown onto the wall. A quarrel turning into a fight? Just as Wendell mumbled, he heard the shouting, cursing, and screaming of a woman. Beating a woman? As a lone gentleman, although Wendell believed in the Lord of Storms and discriminated against women, it didn't stop him from thinking that men shouldn't be violent towards women. After 2 seconds of consideration, he decided to knock on the door and remind his neighbors to take note. At that moment, a tragic cry rang out. This was obviously from a man. Thud. Something heavy fell to the floor. Wendell's brows twitched as he sharply caught the scent of a criminal case. He stood up, put on his coat, and went to the room next door. He bent his fingers and knocked twice. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and a beautiful woman with long wavy hair appeared in front of Wendell. Her hair was in a mess, and her face was ghastly pale. Her light green clothes were stained with blood, and she was holding a dagger that was dripping with blood. The lady in her early 20s stammered for a while before speaking in a dreamy tone, "I killed someone." Chapter 1331 Pleasure in Helping Others. Wendell wasn't unfamiliar with murder at all. When he heard that, he wasn't afraid at all. Instead, he calmly allowed his gaze to wander past the woman at the door and into the room's interior. He immediately saw a man lying on the ground. His chest was blood red. "Are you sure he's dead?" Wendell asked calmly. The young lady in her 20s was at a loss at first. Then she answered with uncertainty, "Maybe. I don't know. If there's still hope, we need to send him to the hospital immediately." Wendell's tone was like he was speaking to a patient's family, not a murderer. The lady holding the blood dagger subconsciously turned her body and made way. Wendell took a few steps forward and approached the victim. He didn't need to squat down. He swept his gaze and made a judgment based on various signs. He is indeed dead. The woman in her 20s with messy, flaxen-colored hair didn't show any obvious change in expression. She looked down at her toes and said, "Call the police. How do I address you?" Wendell had already heard hurried footsteps coming from the stairs. It was obvious that the attendant or hotel owner came up to check on the commotion after hearing the screams. "Tracy," the pure lady with an attitude answered softly. She then sank into her own world and didn't say another word. Wendell was just about to say something when the owner of the hotel who had helped him check in previously had already rushed through the door. "Goddess!" the elderly man shouted after seeing the situation in the room. Wendell pressed down with his right hand, gesturing for him to calm down before saying, "Call the police immediately. I'll stay here and watch." His temperament and words exuded a sense of confidence that convinced others. The owner of the hotel didn't waste any time and immediately turned around and ran downstairs. As for Wendell, when he first came over to check on the situation, it was just a habit as a gentleman. In fact, he didn't have the intention to get involved in it. After all, he was still shouldering the mission. However, Miss Tracy's dazed, detached, and cold attitude induced a sense of pity in him. This was a normal reaction for a man. He surveyed the area as though he was conversing with the air. Killing someone doesn't imply a harsh punishment. It can be categorized into many kinds of situations. Tracy slowly raised her head and cast her gaze at the gentleman. There was an indescribable luster in her lifeless eyes. Wendell glanced at her bruised face. "He hit you?" "Yes." The man seemed to have some sort of authority, making Tracy, who wanted to remain silent, finally answer. Wendell looked down at the dagger that was no longer dripping blood. "Was it you who brought it here or him?" Tracy's response was a little slow as she replied, "Him." Wendell nodded slightly and said, "Exercising your right to self-defense is in line with the law. I can testify to the police that you had an intense argument before it happened and that there was a fight. Clearly, men naturally possess an advantage in this aspect. I'm not discriminating against women, but it's something explained by science and experience." He paused and asked, "What is the relationship between the two of you? What happened?" Tracy's eyes darted about and she recovered a little from that deep reclusive state. She seemed to be answering a policeman's question as she said with a look of hope and sorrow, I am his mistress." Upon saying this, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Tracy's face. "I used to be an ugly woman who blindly chased after money. Not long after I left the grammar school, I became his mistress under his enticement. He gave me a hotel and let me stay there. I wait for his arrival or for him to summon me every week. I lost interest in this lifestyle, feeling increasingly suppressed as my inferiority complex grew. I wanted to return everything to him and get rid of him completely, but he wasn't agreeable. He threatened me using all sorts of methods and refused to let me leave him. The recent times we met all ended in fights. Just now, he said that there was only one way to leave him, and that was death. Then, he beat me up and took out a dagger. Why, you know what happened after that." "Mistress." Wendell cast a regretful and pitiful glance at Tracy's face and said, The traces at the scene have also confirmed the development of the situation. He had originally thought that Tracy and the deceased were husband and wife, but to his surprise, their relationship was worse than he had imagined. Tracy nodded blankly and said, "Thank you." She didn't say another word. She only broke the silence when the police arrived. She raised her hands and accepted the handcuffs. Wendell looked at her staggered pace and said to the police, "Bring her to check on her injuries first and treat them to avoid any accidents." The police officers didn't know why they had to listen to instructions from a witness. In short, they led Tracy and Wendell to a small hospital in the city without any objections under the heavy rain. As Tracy was a woman, Wendell and 2 police officers waited in the corridor of the hospital without entering the room. As time passed, Wendell saw a pregnant woman being sent to the delivery room in a hurry. There seemed to be some problems and they needed help with the labor process. After a while, he heard the sound of a baby crying, an announcement of a new life coming to this world. At this moment, Tracy happened to come out. "Do you feel it?" "Life's beauty," Wendell said to Tracy solemnly. As Tracy listened to the baby's cries amidst the howling wind and rain, her expression was clearly touched. Her face had already been wiped clean, making her look very clean and simple. After a few seconds, Tracy returned to her senses and nodded at Wendell before saying, "Thank you." This time, she was no longer as numb, blank, and reclusive. Wendell secretly heaved a sigh of relief and followed her to the police station to record a statement. After doing what was necessary, Wendell walked to the street side and prepared to take a rental carriage back to the Irises Hotel. However, in the middle of the stormy night, there were no pedestrians or carriages on the road. This is the disadvantage of a small city. "It's not convenient enough," Wendell muttered. He opened the umbrella he had brought with him and made his way back to the Irises Hotel. As a former sheriff, he had the memory, in the mystical sense, of the route he had taken before. He wasn't worried about getting lost in the small city. At this moment, the storm had already reduced significantly. However, the strong winds continued to sweep past Wendell, causing rain to fall on him. This caused Wendell to raise his right hand and block his chest. That confidential document was hidden on the inside of the clothing. Wendell had previously kept the document close to him even when he was sleeping, not allowing it to be separated from him. For this reason, he had already developed a habit. As long as he had the corresponding self-reminders, he wouldn't turn over once he fell asleep. After walking for about 15 minutes in the small town of Utopia, Wendell saw the Irises Hotel. At that moment, his top hat and clothes were drenched due to the strong winds. This made him a little worried that the confidential document would be damaged by the water. Strictly speaking, I have already violated the rules of the mission, but how could I not help a lady like her? This is what a gentleman should do. Wendell was slightly vexed, but he didn't regret it at all. After entering the room, he immediately removed his jacket and took out the document, placing it on the table. The envelope containing the document was already visibly soaked. There were quite a few places that seemed to tear with a little force. Wendell immediately rang the bell and called for an attendant to ask for a gas stove, hoping to raise the temperature in the room and accelerate the air-drying process of the sealed document. In the process of waiting, he realized that the silence expected from the middle of the night wasn't there. It was as if the screams and the police's arrival had caused the tenants and nearby residents to wake up without being able to fall asleep. The howling winds lessened significantly, and Wendell could hear children crying, married couples arguing, the sound of a wooden violin being played, intermittent sobbing, the footsteps on the stairs, and the occasional sounds of discussion that were sometimes suppressed and sometimes raised without realizing it. He didn't feel anything about this lively scene. He just felt that they were noisy that prevented him from calming down. After a while, the attendant brought over a coal stove. Wendell relaxed and asked casually, "Do you know that Miss Tracy?" The thin attendant shook his head. "No." He then added, "I heard that she's a local, but I've been living outside in the plantations outside the city before this year." "What do you know about her?" Wendell asked subconsciously. "She comes to our hotel 3 to 5 times a month, with the dead man." The waiter suddenly sighed. "She's not happy at all." Wendell was silent for a few seconds before dismissing the attendant and returning to his desk. Seconds ticked by as the envelope outside the confidential document gradually dried up. At this moment, the inside and outside of the hotel had become relatively quiet. Only the sound of rain falling and the sound of the windows being rattled by the winds could be heard. Wendell was full of spirit as he recalled everything that had happened. He sighed for Miss Tracy's life and flipped the envelope. At this moment, he realized that some damage had appeared on the bottom part of the envelope, revealing the piece of paper inside. Wendell frowned, knowing that he was about to be punished. Of course, the punishment wouldn't be too heavy, as if the document to be distributed was confidential enough. He wouldn't be the only one to dispatch it. Wendell had originally planned on maintaining the present state and showing the damaged situation during the handover. However, when he swept his gaze, he saw a word on the document through the hole. Utopia. Wendell's nerves tightened, and he felt as if the sound of the wind and rain outside had suddenly stopped. Chapter 1332. Shocked in the middle of the night. Why is the confidential document that I'm dispatching mentioning Utopia? What's so special about this place? Many thoughts flashed through Wendell's mind as he heard a buzzing sound. At this moment, he felt as though he was going to fall sick from overexertion. Wendell quickly forced himself to calm down. He carefully recalled all the experiences he had encountered after coming to Utopia, and he discovered that there were no problems with every detail. They were all things that he might encounter in daily life. The only thing that made him uneasy was that his arrival was too coincidental. It was common for the steam locomotive to stop at the last minute due to a storm, but to stop somewhere related to the confidential document in his hand couldn't be explained away with coincidence. Wendell stared at the confidential document on the table with a solemn expression. He hesitated as to whether he should open them and read them carefully. Perhaps it's just a passing mention of Utopia. My actions will severely violate internal affairs. Perhaps this is the report of a certain intelligence agent secretly investigating Utopia. The contents will decide whether I survive to a certain extent, or die. After struggling for a while, Wendell looked out the window at the dark night sky and reached for the document. Only by being alive could one consider the punishment. Having made up his mind, Wendell swiftly removed the envelope outside and flipped through the typed files inside. As he read, his hand trembled slightly. He felt a chill run down his back. Even the burning furnace didn't help. No matter which angle he read it from, the confidential report in his hands indicated that there was something wrong with Utopia, the entire town. This might be a city that didn't exist in the real world. Wendell felt his mouth go dry, as though he had heard the footsteps of death slowly approaching him with a sickle. Instinctively, he wanted to get up, but in the end, he controlled himself and didn't react rashly. This was because he could feel pairs of eyes staring at him in the darkness outside, the room upstairs, and the corridor outside. What should I do? Up till now, nothing abnormal happened. This means that if I didn't know anything, it's possible that I'd be safe and welcome daybreak. I've read through a lot of information, and if I rashly show that I already know about the strange environment around me, it would only cause danger to erupt ahead of time. However, I can't just not do anything and leave my fate to luck. Wendell recalled all the dangers he had experienced before and quickly made up his mind. He was prepared to immediately return to the steam locomotive and stay far away from Utopia to a certain extent. At least, most of the people there were normal, while the city was full of danger. Of course, Wendell couldn't just run back like that. He had to act normal, as though he had left the hotel in the middle of the night to return to the steam locomotive station. Amidst his thoughts, Wendell put away his confidential report and stood up calmly. He put on his coat and put on his top hat. Then, with his luggage in one hand and an umbrella in the other, he calmly walked to the door and turned the doorknob. At this moment, the corridor was dark, with only a few gas lamps on both sides of the corridor giving off light that wasn't bright enough. It added signs of human life to the silent environment in which he could hear a pin drop. When Wendell entered the corridor, the wooden floor beneath his feet made a slight creaking sound. It was so clear in the silent night that it traveled far into the distance. With a slight frown, Wendell intentionally took a normal step forward and approached the staircase in the middle of the corridor. He walked without any worries and had no intention of acting furtively. As he saw the stairs getting closer, he suddenly heard a squeaking sound behind him. "Sir, where are you going?" A slightly hoarse and intermittent male voice sounded in Wendell's ears. Wendell's body stiffened. He slowly turned back and saw the wooden door to the service room open. An attendant came out and stood in the shadows of the door. He quickly smiled and said calmly, "I have an important item on the steam locomotive. I'm afraid that someone would take it away, so I have no choice but to return now." At this point, he softly grumbled, A murder happened at the hotel. I don't want to stay here anymore. I can't sleep at all. I'm very sorry. The attendant bowed slightly and responded. I won't spread the news. Wendell nodded with a promise and then walked back up the stairs. Perhaps it was due to the dim lighting in the night. He walked very carefully. Every step was like walking on the edge of a precipice. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Wendell, who had been on guard towards the attendant behind him, finally returned to the first floor. At that moment, not a single person was present in the hotel lobby. All the items were hidden in the darkness, and the faint light from the outside cast a blurry silhouette, just like monsters eager to devour people. Wendell looked ahead and walked through the dark lobby before reaching the door. Just as he pushed open the door and went out, he suddenly heard some rustling sounds behind him. It was as if there were rats moving around, or it was as if someone was approaching him with light footsteps. The back of Wendell's head went numb, but he held back his impulse to make a dash for it. He raised his head normally and looked up at the sky, which had already stopped raining. Then, he inhaled the cold, fresh air and made his way to the steam locomotive station. He quickened his pace, looking like he was afraid of the night and eager to end this journey. As he walked, Wendell saw a signboard from the corner of his eye. Utopia Telegraph Office. The telegraph office. Perhaps I can try sneaking in and send an emergency telegram to the Backlund headquarters and Eskelson military base. That way, I can look forward to the rescue from demigods. If I'm really trapped here and unable to leave, this will be the only way to save myself. Wendell thought for a moment before taking a few steps diagonally, arriving at the entrance of the Utopia Telegraph Office. He wasn't in a hurry to find a place to sneak in. Instead, he focused his attention and listened to the movements inside. Following that, he heard intermittent sounds of heavy breathing. This made Wendell occasionally feel that there was no one inside, and at times, he felt that there was more than one person inside. Suddenly, the sound of breathing stopped. All of Wendell's hair stood on end. His intuition told him that a figure was standing quietly behind the door of the telegraph office. Without any hesitation, Wendell immediately gave up the thought of sending a telegram. He walked past the door and continued proceeding forward. For the rest of the journey, even a gust of wind left Wendell trembling in fear. He was afraid of encountering an unknown danger. Time passed slowly as Wendell experienced the torment. Finally, he reached the entrance of the steam locomotive station and saw that the door was tightly shut. He couldn't enter. This wasn't a problem for Wendell. He first passed the umbrella to his left hand that was carrying his luggage, then went to the side and found a wall. With a press of his palm, he rose into the air and easily flipped over. After landing his feet firmly on the ground, Wendell heaved a sigh of relief and began walking towards the platform at an unhurried pace. At that moment, an inaudible sound of footsteps could be heard behind him. "What are you doing here?" A deep and hoarse voice rang out. Wendell's toes tightened as cold sweat broke out on his back. He didn't hesitate. As he prepared to get violent, he made his body turn slowly and stiffly. The first thing that entered his eyes was a classic glass lantern, followed by the staff member from before. Wendell exhaled and grumbled, "It's not appropriate for you to appear in such an environment on such a night. As a gentleman, you have to avoid scaring others." "I'm not a gentleman," the staff member replied in an unfriendly manner. Wendell pointed to the corner of the platform. "I'm going to the bathroom." He had already observed the platform's environment and layout of the platform earlier in the day. "Then why are you here?" the worker asked. "I'm lost," Wendell answered simply. Following that, he ignored the staff and walked towards the bathroom. Behind him, the staff member watched silently without saying a word. This gave Wendell a lot of mental stress, but he maintained his gait very well. In the bathroom, under the illumination of the wall lamps, Wendell took nearly a minute to relieve the tension in his body and successfully peed. Chapter 1333 Warning. Using his experience as example, all of a sudden, the muscles on Wendell's back began to tense up as if he were about to explode. He was shocked and doubtful as several guesses flashed through his mind. The residents of Utopia are monsters in human skin. They usually look normal, but once they encounter blind spots in logic, they would show a side that is different from an ordinary person, ignoring the points that are obviously problematic. Or perhaps that staff realized that I was lying and was unwilling to deal with me, so he pretended not to see me and let me go? But why? Yes, carrying my luggage to the bathroom can be explained away as me being afraid of losing my luggage, but the entire platform is sheltered. There's no need to take the umbrella. Besides, the rain had already stopped. Wendell instinctively turned his gaze out of the window, only to see the sunlight shining on the platform he was at. One by one, passengers waited in order behind the safety line, completely different from the dark and gloomy vibes that Utopia gave off. Phew. He exhaled and suddenly relaxed. This isn't Utopia. I've already left. Wendell murmured to himself as he wiped away the cold sweat that had seeped out from his forehead. When he recalled his oversight earlier, it was as if he had fallen into a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from no matter how hard he tried. After a while, Wendell stood up and decided to smoke at the platform to ease his mood. The tobacco comforted him greatly, allowing him to recall his past experiences in Utopia. During this process, he gained inspiration from his encounter. Maybe it's because I sincerely helped Tracy, so that staff member intentionally ignored my problematic actions and let me go? Compared to the entire population of Utopia being monsters hiding underneath human skin, Wendell was more willing to accept this explanation. At this moment, from the corner of his eye, he saw the conductor talking to a group of people in a corner. Wendell took a few steps forward, trying to hear what they were saying. With the help of his hearing that transcended the normal limits of hearing, he vaguely heard the conversation from a distance that wouldn't incur suspicion. Last night, the station, Utopia, doesn't exist in the kingdom. Please keep it a secret. Wendell's brows twitched slightly. Based on the description of the document near his chest, he roughly understood what the train conductor was talking about. They were saying that the kingdom didn't have a station known as Utopia at all, and last night, the steam locomotive had gone missing. At that moment, a strong sense of horror surged through Wendell's heart again. He felt that it was his greatest blessing to be able to leave Utopia alive. Alfred spent nearly a week before returning to Backlund from Eskilstuna Harbor. This was because he had visited the family of his deceased comrades, his old friends, the elders who had returned to their fee for vacation, and some of his family's business partners along the way. This is even more tiring than participating in battle, Alfred grumbled to his father, Earl Hall. Earl Hall smiled and pointed at the staircase. Return to your room and get some rest. We'll talk in the study later. He was quite satisfied with the mental state and progress of his second son. Alfred surveyed the area and asked with a smile, "Where's the most dazzling jewel of Backlund?" He paused for a moment before adding, "What about Hibbert?" Earl Hall laughed and said, "Audrey went to her foundation and will only return in the afternoon. She kept complaining that you couldn't provide her with a definite schedule, preventing her from knowing when you would arrive. Hibbert is now a cabinet secretary. He's very busy." Alfred nodded and returned to his room to take a shower. He changed into a shirt, vest, and formal suit. "I prefer East Balam's casualness." He looked into the mirror and smiled at his adjutant. "This outfit makes you look more like a noble," his adjutant said as he handed him the document in his hand. "General, this is from MI9. Me 9. Alfred thoughtfully destroyed the seal on the envelope. "There's a result regarding the investigation of Utopia that quickly?" Before he could finish his sentence, he pulled out the document and flipped through it. During this process, Alfredo flipped through the pages slower and slower. In the end, he read it again from the first page. The main content of this investigation was divided into two parts. The first was regarding the MI9 member who had dispatched Alfred's report. He had accidentally entered Utopia and witnessed a murder case. He managed to forcefully escape in the middle of the night and return to the steam locomotive. The second was that the railways in Desi Bay which led to Backlund didn't have a stop named Utopia Station along the way, nor was there a harbor known as Utopia in the Berserk Sea. The subsequent investigators didn't find any traces. The two cases didn't exceed the limits of Alfred's imagination. What surprised him was the criminal involved in the murder. Her name was Tracy. She was the owner of a hotel. She had received middle-class education and graduated from grammar school. After that, she became a mistress of a businessman. Recently, she was trying to free herself from this identity. This was identical to the owner of the Harbor Hotel, Tracy, that Alfred had met. Every detail matched. As a result, Alfred determined that the culprit behind the murder was Tracy, the beautiful woman who had received a certain degree of education, who was able to produce sad music in the middle of the night. Is this her backstory? Alfred muttered to himself silently. This made the residents of Utopia seem very realistic. It wasn't what Alfred had expected. An illusion. In other words, after the outsiders left, the inhabitants of Utopia continued to lead their own lives. They had their own love, hatred, pains and sorrow. They had all sorts of experiences. Apart from Utopia seeming to not exist in the real world, it was similar to any ordinary town in the Lone Kingdom. Perhaps Utopia is real. Everyone there is real. However, if one wants to enter the town, they have to be in the right place at the right time. Alfred nodded indiscernibly and put away the investigation report he had received from MI9. To him, even if this matter ended here, he had no intention to investigate further. One had to know that, in the southern continent, there were countless bizarre incidents and phenomena. If one was too curious, it would only bring him greater danger than he imagined. After adjusting his clothes and mood, Alfred came to his father's study and knocked on the door with his curled finger. "Come on in." Earl Hall's voice rang out. Alfred tidied his blonde hair, pushed the door open, and sat down. Earl Hall smiled at him and said, "You're already a man." "No one would say such words to a man," Alfred replied without any reservations. "In my heart, you're still that rebellious youth," Earl Hall said with a smile. "You're already a Sequence 5 Beyonder?" Alfred replied with a double entendre. "Yes, I am a real knight." Earl Hall nodded and suddenly sighed. "You should have experienced a lot of hardship. From what I know, no matter if it's the potions or war, they will bring serious damage to people, from their bodies to their minds. Everyone undergoes a lot of pain in their lives," Alfred said with a sigh. He used a lone-styled euphemism. After a pause he added, "Compared to when I left Backland, my present state is even better. As long as I grasp a method properly, I don't need to worry too much about the impact of the madness at my level." Earl Hall didn't continue on this matter and instead said, "Your sister has also become a Beyonder." "Oh." Alfred was shocked at first, but then he remembered something. He said with some annoyance, "I thought she just changed her hobby." "From the looks of it, Audrey's adventure had a little bit of your help," Earl Hall said, seemingly enlightened. "I hope you can talk to her about how dangerous, crazy and painful it is about the sequence potions. Let her remain at her current level." Alfred replied without hesitation, "I'll do it." In the evening, in Audrey's small study room. "Alfred, why are you looking for me?" Audrey, who had changed into home clothes, led Susie and opened the door for her brother. She had been waiting for her brother for a few minutes. "I have something to warn you of." Alfred walked into the study and casually pulled a chair over. Audrey smiled and pointed at the golden retriever. "Do you need Susie to leave?" Alfred couldn't help but smile as he looked at the obedient golden retriever who was sitting by the side, her eyes filled with a look of sentience. "There's no need for that. I believe it won't eavesdrop on our conversation." "She," Audrey casually corrected him. After the noble girl sat opposite him, Alfred sighed inwardly. After not seeing her for a few years, her younger sister was no longer as tender as before. Regardless of her looks or temperament, she had already reached a level that brought about amazement. She was no longer the little girl from the past. Alfred retracted his gaze and asked casually, "I heard that you became a Beyonder?" "Yes." Audrey nodded frankly. Alfred had originally planned on asking what sequence she was, but after some thought, he felt that it was too direct. It was easy for her to flare up, so he deliberated over his words and said, "You should be a Beyonder of the Spectator Pathway, right? The Rainbow Salamander has similar powers." The Rainbow Salamander was a gift from Alfred to his sister. After Audrey gave an affirmative answer, Alfred joked, "Can you do treatment in the mind domain now? Most Beyonders, including me, need help in this aspect." "Yes. I forgot to tell you that I'm already a Sequence 5 disciplinary paladin of the Arbiter Pathway." Audrey pursed her lips and smiled. "I'm a qualified psychiatrist who has undergone professional training. You can verify this with father and mother." "She's already a Sequence 7. Alfred's expression gradually turned solemn. "Audrey, I have to remind you that the potions do not only bring about strength." Having said that, he paused and observed his sister's reaction. He realized that Audrey wasn't impatient at all and was listening very seriously. Every potion contains madness that can lead to a loss of control. I've seen similar situations before. More than once. They happen to my enemies, and they happen to my friends. No one is spared. Alfred amalgamated his experiences in East Balam and began explaining the dangers of the potion in detail. During this process, he realized that his sister, Audrey, wasn't the only one listening attentively. Furthermore, Susie, the golden retriever, appeared extremely quiet. Chapter 1334 Night with the Moon. MI9's office building was located on Bellato Street in West Borough, and it was an inconspicuous three-story building. The entrance didn't show any signs of its identity. It simply hung a door sign, 9. The core of this office building was underground, and above it was for the clerks. Of course, most of the Beyonders who were under MI9 wouldn't go underground for no reason. The environment there wasn't good, and the atmosphere was oppressive. It was possible that an accident could happen due to the failure to watch over a sealed artifact. Xiao was now the deputy team leader of the National Security and Counter-Espionage Team. She was in charge of a rather small-scale Beyonder team, responsible for handling espionage cases regarding Intis in the greater area of Backland. There's a mission here. Her superior, MI9's deputy director, the team leader of the National Security and Counter-Espionage Team, Lieutenant General Pantek, picked up a document and handed it across the desk opposite him. Is it very urgent? Xiao received it and asked cautiously. Lieutenant General Pantek was a typical lone old man with a case of severe hairline recession. He picked up a white porcelain coffee cup and took a sip. Not at all. It's quite low risk. In fact, this mission will be sent to all members, hoping that someone will be able to complete it by luck. This description was out of Xiao's expectations, but she didn't open the dossier on the spot and directly replied, I will inform my team members. Xiao returned to her own room after leaving Lieutenant General Pantek's office. When she threw herself into her seat, she seemed to have hidden herself. Xiao quickly browsed through the documents in her hand and roughly understood why the deputy director said that. The utopia that needed investigation didn't seem to be anywhere in the northern and southern continent, nor were there on any of the known islands in the 5 seas. In the past 2 weeks, many people had entered the so-called utopia, but the way they entered was completely different. Some entered from the Berserk Sea's Sonia sea waters, arriving by a terrifying storm. Some were midway on a railway that led from Desi Bay to Backland. Due to a heavy storm, they had been delayed and stopped at the city. Others were in Civilaus County, and they entered because they were lost. Up to now, no one has been affected by the damage or mentally influenced. It's no wonder Deputy Director Pantek said that the danger level is very low. Also, there's no way to conclude the rules regarding the case, making it difficult for one to find the true location of Utopia. Therefore, there's no way for them to send people in to investigate. Yes, I can only tell all members of the situation, and hope that one of them will chance upon Utopia and carefully gather information in secret when they are there. Xiao put down the documents in her hand and stood up regretfully, preparing to inform the Beyonders under her. She was regretful that the mission was so difficult that she almost couldn't see hope. This made her unable to accumulate more merit points. In the past half-year, Xiao had been very busy every day in order to deal with the pending apocalypse. As she dealt with MI9's matters, she completed all the missions Mr. Fool had given her, so as to accumulate contributions on both sides in exchange for the formula and Beyonder characteristics of the imperative mage formula and Beyonder characteristic, to fulfill the wish of becoming a demigod. And up till now, Xiao was still lacking a little on both fronts, especially in MI9. If she didn't make any significant contribution, Xiao couldn't see any hope. If not for the generous salary from MI9 and all kinds of benefits that came with it, and how she could rely on her status and identity to monopolize a large amount of information, so as to help her complete the missions given by Mr. Fool, Xiao yearned to resign and become a bounty hunter again. That way she would have more freedom. I can ask about this case at the next tarot gathering. Perhaps Mr. World will have some clues. As Xiao thought, she pushed open the door to the room where her team members were. After assigning the Utopia mission, Xiao specially instructed, if the situation isn't right, even if you have the chance to enter Utopia, you can give up immediately. The town of unknown authenticity hasn't shown any danger. Perhaps it's because it hadn't been triggered. After busying herself for a while more, Xiao finally ended her day in exhaustion. She returned home before 7:30, and she had dinner with her mother, her brother, and Furs. She enjoyed a limited amount of relaxation. At midnight, she washed up and walked to the bedroom window. She grabbed the curtain and prepared to draw it. During this process, Zio naturally cast her gaze outside and discovered that the crimson moon in the sky had already turned bigger at some point in time. Furthermore, the color had clearly deepened as though it was flowing blood. Blood moon. Zio suddenly turned her head and looked next door in concern. She was a little worried about her good friend's condition. However, she quickly recalled that Furs was a sequence 4 demigod and no longer feared the effects of the full moon ravings. In the room next door, Furs was lying in bed, taking in the blood moon outside. As she endured the pain of her head being pricked by needles, she heard Mr. Dorr say, "Although going from sequence 3 to sequence 2 is indeed a qualitative change, going from an incomplete mythical creature to a real mythical creature, I believe that sequence 4 to sequence 3 has a qualitative change as well. It can even be said that sequence 3 is the best level in a Beyonder pathway. At this level, there is no need to rely on external forces to resist the madness and the inclination towards losing control. There is no need to endure the torment every second and minute. They will also possess Beyonder powers that completely exceed that of an ordinary person. They will be more godlike than they are human. Furthermore, they can obtain a small number of anchors and stabilize their mental state. If not for the fact that most sequence 3 Beyonders don't have long enough lives, with it being difficult for them to live to more than 500 years old, I believe there won't be many saints who have the motivation to advance to an angel." Yeah. Furs nodded, indicating that she had already understood. At the same time, her forehead twitched slightly and she yawned secretly. She was already a little accustomed to the pain from her direct conversation with Mr. Dorr. Mr. Dorr continued, "The apprentice pathways sequence 3 is Wanderer. This means that the spirit world can no longer trap you. You can enter the cosmos, travel the astral world, head to different planets, and see true dead silence, true barrenness, true magnificence, and completely different civilizations. Only after experiencing it for yourself will you understand how insignificant the world you live in is." Mr. Dorr briefly explained his experiences as a showcase of the magnificence and beauty of the cosmos, displaying the stateliness and charm of different civilizations. This made Furs fall into a trance. If not for the sharp throbbing pain in her head still reminding her, she would have even forgotten that the speaker was a dangerous king of angels. "As long as you help me escape, I'll give you the potion formula and Beyonder characteristic of a wanderer and help you complete the ritual. Of course, this can be paid in advance." At the end of the full moon ravings, Mr. Dorr gave another promise. "It really makes me look forward to it," Furs marveled sincerely. When Mr. Dorr's voice gradually weakened and disappeared, Furs suddenly pulled out the pillow at her waist and lay down. In less than 3 minutes, she fell asleep in peace. To her, the vast cosmos was indeed filled with charm. However, it also contained the danger of being corrupted just from knowing about it. She had no motivation to explore it. "I'll consider it after touring all the places in the northern and southern continent and the 5 seas." In her sleep, Furs muttered almost silently to herself. At that moment, the blood-red moon outside the window had already faded. It returned to a light crimson color and wasn't full. A huge blood-colored moon hung on the edge of the cliff, illuminating the swamp below. The swamp was dark red and constantly bubbling, as though lava was boiling at the bottom of it. At a glance, there was no end to the swamp, like a vast ocean. Pa! A stone fell from the edge of the cliff and into the swamp. In the next second, a bubble appeared and silently burst, producing a blood-stained infant. The baby staggered, swam towards the cliff, and attempted to climb up. Pa! The stone beneath Emlyn White's feet shattered as he fell off the cliff and into the swamp. This sanguine earl suddenly jolted awake from his dream. He looked around in horror and confusion. After confirming that this was his room, where there were many extremely familiar dolls of different sizes, Emlyn slowly exhaled and said to himself with a rather solemn expression, "That dream wasn't simple." As a shaman king, he had a good understanding of a dreamscape. Could this be the so-called divine revelation? But I didn't receive any revelations. Emlyn thought for a few seconds but couldn't come up with an answer. Then, he decided to ignore the problem and prepare to ask Father Yutravsky when he had the time. The incomplete moon that had its blood-red colors faded illuminated the garden of the Cathedral of Waves. Alger reached out his hand to grab the note delivered by the gale and read it. "Verdu is looking for a pirate ship or a smuggling ship to Bansi. Bansi Harbor had yet been rebuilt, and there were no liners from all over the world that headed there. Verdu, who treasured his limited teleportation opportunities, could only rely on extremely normal methods. Head to Bansi? Alger immediately frowned. He knew what Bansi meant, but he didn't understand why Verdu wanted to go to Bansi. There should be nothing there. No, even if the church has leveled Bansi, there's still something abnormal about it. Furthermore, the church didn't investigate what problems Bansi had hidden in the past. As a cardinal, Alger was qualified to read through some confidential documents, including the records of the actions that the Church of the Lord of Storms had done when dealing with Bansi. In addition, he had also learned more from Mr. Fool and the World Gairman Sparrow. After some thought, Alger quickly came to a decision. He planned on getting his shadow guard to arrange a pirate ship for Verdu. In this aspect, Alger knew many key people to aid him. It didn't need him to show his face in person or use his name. Of course, smuggling ships in the Rorstad archipelago were often equivalent to pirate ships. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.